Broadcasting from the dark corners of the earth, it's Tom Mordred's Midnight Radio. Well, we're here. January 31st. The first month of 2025 is over, and it's already looking like it's going to be a shit show. Things are about to get rough, I think, in the world. But that's okay, because the world isn't real. Because it ended on October 12th, 1970. And tonight we're going to finally find out how and why. I've been reading Dead Romance for a little while now, and well, it's been going pretty well, I think. I'm going to make sure that the stream details are right in just a moment. Yes, done. Perfect. How do I put this? This is the final day as well for the fundraiser for Bad Crew Theater's production of, what do you call it? Dead Romance. It's being made into a stage version to allow us a bit of... I don't know if Dead Romance would benefit from being made into a movie. It could be made into a movie, which I can't say the same for some of Lawrence Miles' other work, but... I think that Dead Romance is probably in its best form in a book, but I think is a very good thing to adapt. And the reason that we are adapting Dead Romance into a stage show is because it's the kind of story we want to tell, something raw and personal and passionate. And even if it is something that is now outdated by its author's view, and as he says in the prologue, Lawrence Miles states that he can barely recognize the person who wrote that. Even the 5 years after it was republished. Who's to say what it will look like? But who's to say how we will feel about things in what do you call it? Our future. Maybe we'll look back on that and go, ooh, maybe we shouldn't have done Dead Romance. But I think it's going to be good. Rehearsals are already underway, and we had our first rehearsal yesterday. A proper rehearsal, I should say, with our Christine and our Quedge, and I think I did a very good job at... not a very good job. I'm not... Why should I be tooting my horn? It was very fun. We had a fun rehearsal, and so it's... I think it's going to, at the very least, be a... informative isn't the word. It's going to be a unique show, and we're certainly trying to get more genre fiction on stage. Too many white people dramas, or racial dramas, or things that are just dramas that people don't really want to watch. You might be wondering, what's the next book you're going to read? Which I'm probably going to keep reading, maybe not directly after this. I'm a bit busy for the next few days. But another another story that I was planning on adapting was John Gardner's Grendel. But that'll probably just get read here. I doubt that I will have the strength of will to do it. Bad Crew will be doing more theater as time goes on. Hopefully we can build up steam and go harder and stronger and faster and all that good stuff. Welcome to everyone who's listening. A quick recap of the events that have occurred so far. Christine Summerfield has been revealed to live inside of a bottle universe inside of Quedge's real universe. Christine initially takes this pretty well, just kind of sticking to Quedge's side and making sure that she doesn't get hurt. And Quedge certainly encourages this. However, recently, her most recent discovery has made her somewhat miserable, and she woke up one morning with the desire to leave. She said, I think the last quote was, "Quedge's world wasn't big and bright enough for me, and space is like any other drug. It has its highs and its lows." Now, as far as the other aspects of the plot, the bottle is made by, or the bottle universe was made by sphinxes, and they have detected disturbances, and it's believed that something has come through from the vortex into the world, and the vortex, which is used to get between places when Quedge's employers are traveling through time and space. And all the lost things in the vortex are going to break through into Christine's world. At least that seems to be what the problem is, and Quedge's employers, as well as Keist, the Beetle Man, they are doing their best to combat this, and work with the Sphinxes to eliminate the threat, so that way they can have their small survival team move into the bottle. I think that's about it for the summary. I don't have much else. I think there wasn't anything else that happened that was that won't be reiterated, I should say, for the story. So without further ado, I think we should just dive in and keep going. And this will be a longer stream tonight, as I intend to finish this book tonight. There's not much reason not to. I just realized the laundry is probably picking it up. Just think of it as some nice white noise in the background. Just some pleasant laundry sounds. Until I get a proper studio, and or have the money to have a proper studio, you're just going to have to put up with background sounds. Or until we can get some kind of soundproofing for this microphone. Alright, first, posture check. Make sure you're sitting comfortably. Alright. Let's begin. Or end, as it were. Third notebook. 128 pages, 8 blank. Notes on reproduction. 1. The scroll that Chris Quedge bought for me on Signy 8.6, the one that charts the history of the Summerfield name in the real world, isn't really parchment at all. It's some kind of computer, pulped down until it's as flat as paper, just like that copy of the Times with the talking colonists. If you press the names on the family tree, then little windows of ink open up and tell you more about the generations of the Summerfields. Because of this, I know that Jonah Summerfield was born in 1930 and died in an industrial accident in 1975. The scroll says that he was skilled in different kinds of crafts, but that his main line of work was in the military. I think what this means is that he spent his life being pushed from one job to another and got called up for national service sometime in the 50s. The family tree also tells me that Jonah was just 18 when he got his wife to be pregnant, and the boy child they ended up with was also called Jonah. Jonah Jr. was born in 1948, the same year as me. I know Jonah Jr. must have been a child of his time, because when he had a son of his own, in 1970, another big date in my personal diary, he called the baby Valentine. After the lead character in Stranger in a Strange Land, probably. You'd be amazed how many people had the same idea in the late 60s. When Jonah Summerfield Jr. called his firstborn Valentine, he was actually starting a long tradition of Summerfields with stupid names. Valentine's one male child was called Benedict, born in 1990, and I have no idea what might make someone give their son a name like that. Maybe there was a famous pop star called Benedict in the 1990s. Who knows? 2. It wasn't hard to find a decent Coke supply in London, 1970. You just had to know which public toilets to hang around. On the 5th of October, I got back to the flat after a happy afternoon's toilet shopping and found a note from Quedge waiting for me on the doorstep. Something had come up. The monitoring station had another problem, blah, 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 and he'd get back before nightfall unless he got killed or something. So I wasn't expecting to find anybody waiting in the living room. But I found Keist. Keist looked like a totally different kind of killing machine here in the light of the bottle. He sat hunched up in the middle of the floor, his body too bulky to squeeze into any of the bunks, with his grey little face fixed on the TV set, watching Eamon Andrews rounding up the stories on the Today program. He looked up at me when I walked in and grunted. He almost sounded friendly. Whatever kind of tension there'd been between us on Simia KK-98, there didn't seem to be much point to it here in London, away from the battlefield, outside the bottle. "Do you want tea?" I asked him. He shook his head. "Don't drink. Do you rust or something?" It was meant as a joke, but Keith looked at me like he didn't know how to answer. "I can drink," he said, and you could hear his lungs crunching together inside his armor. "I just don't." "Don't you miss it?" Again, he looked like he didn't know how much to say, like he thought I was going to start taking the piss out of him at any second. I wandered over here to him and squatted down on the floor by his side, resting my backside on one of the pillows from the bunk beds. I tried to look serious and interested, so he knew I wasn't joking. "You can feel it," Keith told me in the end. "You can tell what's missing. You don't get thirsty, but you know you're supposed to get thirsty. That's what makes you want to drink." I nodded, still putting on the serious face. "What's it like?" I said. "I mean, not being human anymore." So Keith told me. 3. The family tree doesn't say much about Benedict Summerfield, which I think means that most of the records he left behind are criminal ones. A pretty bad start for the first of the space-age Summerfields. If I'd read between the lines properly, then Benedict must have slithered from one side of the world to the other, dealing in suspect merchandise, drugs, and getting off with as many women as he could on the way. When one of those women gave birth to a boy called Jason in 2007, Benedict didn't hang around. Somehow the kid ended up with his surname anyways. Jason is the most boring Summerfield on record. He spent his life indoors, living on welfare checks and watching TV, just marking time between the more interesting generations on either side of him. He never got away from England, even when the civilization started to fall apart in the 2030s, it says here. In fact, the most interesting thing about him is that when he somehow managed to breed, he called his child Jubilation Constantine Summerfield, thus bringing back the Summerfield tradition of stupid-sounding first names. As things turned out, Jubilation Summerfield, 2039 to 2106, was the first of the family line to leave Earth full-time, setting up a cozy little homestead on one of the outer planets with his wife and 3 children. I imagine them looking like those people in that painting, American Gothic. God-fearing farming folk standing out on the surface of Uranus or somewhere with pitchforks and spacesuits. 21st century Puritans. Maybe that's the kind of life the man was damned to when his dad called him Jubilation. 4. The first time I had sex with Quedge was on the 30th of September, the same day he took me for my first ride on the dragon boat. I'd say it was a part of his technique to get a woman breathless and worn out before he made his move, but frankly I don't think Quedge was ever that aware of what he was doing. The kissing was okay, although you could tell nobody had really told Quedge how to use that big tongue properly. It was after that, after I'd gone past the point of no return by taking my t-shirt off, that he went all serious on me, which made me go all serious. "Look," I said, "I don't know exactly how to put this. Look, I'm not on the pill, okay?" I never bothered seeing a doctor about it. Whatever Lady Diamond used to say about the sexual revolution. I remember telling myself that I hardly ever got into positions where I needed it, but who was I kidding? Quedge just looked confused. "What pill?" he said. "Contraceptive," I told him. "You know." Quedge looked down. Maybe because he was embarrassed. Maybe because he wanted to look at my tits. Such as they were. "That's not a problem, okay? I can't..." "Fine," I said. I just wanted to get the conversation over and done with. 5. In 2079, Jubilation Summerfield made the mistake of calling one of his children Benedict after his grandfather. The family tree shows that any Summerfield called Benedict is bound to turn out bad. And Benedict, too, was one of the worst. This time the scroll tells us about Benedict's career, probably because the AIs who wrote it thought it'd sound romantic and glamorous to admit that there was a psychic assassin in the family. By the time Benedict was arrested, he was only 25. He'd already murdered 63 people, most of them politicians. The hyena, they called him. Maybe it was his laugh. Only spawned 2 children before he was executed. At his trial, the lawyers found out that Benedict had messed around with his ID records at least twice, so for all I know, the last few generations of Summerfields before him were all figments of his imagination, and there never was such a person as Jonah. If so, then I know just how Jonah might feel. Once he'd been taken away from his parents' criminal empire, little Marshall Summerfield lived a long and happy life. He stretched out his days with all kind of futuristic drugs, and had children left, right, and center. One of them was Dylan, born in 2165, when Marshall was 68 years old. The name Dylan makes me think of Bob Dylan, so I like to imagine him as some kind of space bohemian, traveling from planet to planet in his magic bus and singing songs about how bad it was that Earth kept being invaded by aliens. He didn't leave many records behind him, old Dylan. 6-7. Can I ask you something personal? I asked Keist on the 5th of October. Keist spent a few seconds pretending to listen to Eamon Andrews rounding up the headlines, then he nodded. What about the other things? I said. He turned his face to me. I jiggled my eyebrows at him in a kind of nudge-nudge, wink-wink way. Sex? He said. I bit my lip. I had to stop myself laughing at the sound of the word made in his metal windpipe. That's what I was getting at, yeah. Keist shrugged, a great big mechanical shrug. You don't miss anything. You mean you've lost your thing? I nodded towards his crotch, where the suit fabric was stretched to bursting point over his armor. I deliberately didn't use any word that might have meant penis, just in case he hadn't had one even before the mutations had started. I didn't know anything about his species, remember? Like the drink, said Keist. He was talking slowly and carefully, still looking out for traps in the conversation. You know you're supposed to feel something. I've still got the anatomy. I can't imagine it. That's all. Having such a big part of your life. Yes, I spotted the innuendo as soon as I said it, but had to keep talking. Just taken away like that, yeah? Keist snorted. I didn't mind so much this time, because he was snorting at life on the whole, not just at me. Sex is about power structures, he told me. We're stronger without them. What's that supposed to mean? I said. Keist nodded towards the TV, where the credits were rolling on today. Politicians, corporate leaders, they do whatever they think they have to. For power, for money, for status. Why? I shrugged. They want mates, Keist explained. As many as possible. They know the best way of acquiring them. Through power, through influence. I wasn't convinced. I didn't feel like getting off with any politicians, and I said so. Not important, snapped Keist. A bit too quickly, I thought. They pick up the programming in adolescence. Power means mating power. They carry on using the same techniques right through their lives, whatever it costs, whoever it jeopardizes. Wait a minute, I said. What you're saying is that it's women's fault that the world is so fucked up because they kept getting off with Henry Kissinger? Is that it? Your war, Keist noted. Your Vietnam. It's not my war, not important. The war is a territory challenge. The same as any other territory challenge. The rules were thought up by your ancestors when they were still apes. The challenges were just extensions of their mating rituals. That's what your war is. A ritual, driven by the reproductive cycle. But you used to work for a big corporation, I pointed out. And that corporation might have been run by the people like the ones you say are not important, he said, fixing his eyes on the TV screen again, even though nothing interesting was happening there. Here, I told myself, was a deeply repressed individual. You asked whether I felt anything. That's all. I'm not sure I got an answer, I said. Keist took a deep breath, so the armor stretched across his chest, and you could see the little plastic veins pulsing under the skin. I suddenly got the urge to touch them, just to see if they'd go pop. I'm flexible, Keist said. I can still send out sexual chemical signals if I need to. It's part of this body's programming, like any other weapon. That's really the way you see it? I said. Yes, said Keist. So how does this weapon work exactly? I asked. 8. Dylan Summerfield never got married, but one of his hippie girlfriends had his child Candace in 2188. I don't know whether she pronounced it Candice, like the Americans do. I expect so, seeing as she worked in television. Candice is the only woman on the list of the family line. When she got married, she made her husband change his name to Summerfield, and it's the name that's important on the scroll, not the genes. So, why do we think names are so important anyways? According to the rules of Sphinx magic, knowing the real name of something is the first step towards being able to control it, which is maybe why Quedge's employers never let anyone call them by their names. I don't know. I'm just guessing. Candice was some kind of reporter for interplanetary TV, whose career ended up on the rocks after she got too close to the drugs cartel she was supposed to be investigating. Too close, as in close enough to hoover up the stuff herself. Another juicy story for the AIs, and another one that strikes a chord. And in the year 2214, she was stupid enough to call her first child Benedict, not learning from history at all. This Benedict must have wanted to react against his mother, because he grew up to be a policeman on a planet called Vandor Secunda. The scroll doesn't mention any details, but he probably got too close to his prey as well, because he killed himself before he was 30. He left behind a son, another Marshall Summerfield, as well as a daughter, who I'm mentioning only because her name was Christine. The only Christine I've been able to find on the family tree. In his suicide note, Benedict said that all his problems were his mother's fault, and that he wanted the young Marshall to go into military college, where he could learn some proper discipline. It must have worked, seeing as someone called Marshall Summerfield was the head of the Caprese Military Academy for most of the late 23rd century. His son, Marshall Summerfield II, carried on the tradition. So did his son, Marshall III. In fact, by the time Marshall IV was born, the Summerfields had built up their own clique at the Academy, which was apparently famous for its right-wing views and kinky secret rituals. It makes me think of Keist and his universal corporate brotherhood. Marshall IV, however, was a disappointment. 9. One day, just after I had started sleeping with Quedge, I went out to Boots and bought every self-testing kit I could find. Not just pregnancy testing, but tests for infections, tests for VD, tests for anything, really. I knew I couldn't go to the GP. Quedge had told me not to, saying I might have picked up things on Simia KK98 that had just confused the doctors on Earth. I wasn't pregnant. I did 4 separate tests for that, keeping the bathroom door locked while I waited for the results, just in case Quedge came home early from work. Quedge had said he was infertile, but let's be honest, men lie about that kind of thing all the time, even men from other universes. And who was to say what might have been inside me, even if I hadn't been fertilized? I still don't know, to this day, whether any of his employer's poisons got into my systems while we were having sex. My womb could be full of the same stuff that they grow clones in. If I ever have a baby, it'll probably be wearing armor and quoting Shakespeare. 10. Marshall Summerfield IV, 2318 to 62, wasn't the big military man his forefathers had been. And he died in disgrace of a broken heart, according to the family history. It was all because of his sole child, Cathal Summerfield, born in 2344. At 16, Cathal announced that she was going to become an androgenine, which was apparently all the rage in those days. The records aren't sure whether she was Kathy or Cathal first, because by law all gender records were changed when you went through the procedure, although I should imagine she started out in life as Kathy. If he'd been born a boy, he probably would have been called Marshall. As it happened, Kathy Cathal met a bad end after hermaphrodites went out of fashion in the 2360s. She made some quick money by selling her body to medical science, which is why the next Summerfield in the chain was born, and spent all his life, in a laboratory. He was part of an experiment in superfertility, a new way of filling up some of the outer planets in Earth's almost empire. As a result, the experimental baby had a child of his own at the age of 2 in 2365 and died just afterwards. The name of the doomed infant in the laboratory? Well, no prizes for guessing. He was called Benedict. 11. I don't know why I had sex with Keist, exactly. Obviously, it was the stupidest thing to do, under the circumstances. No argument there. Quedge was in the middle of a war, getting ready for Armageddon. The last thing he needed was to worry about that. Maybe I wanted to prove that Keist was wrong about all sex being mixed up with power politics. He didn't really have anything to gain from it, and neither did I. Then again, for all I know, I was a victim of his weapons, those signals his shiny new body was supposed to be able to send out whenever he wanted to attract a female victim. If he did turn on the chemical charm there in the flats, well, I don't suppose I'll ever know whether it was deliberate or just some kind of urge that the poisons in his blood hadn't worked out of his system yet. On the other hand, maybe I'm just too stupid to say no. I don't want to think about what it actually felt like, not in detail. In a lot of ways, it was like the time I lost my virginity, up against a wall in the spare room of somebody else's flat, with everything happening much, much too fast. Cal had been all hair and muscle, more like a force of nature than a human being. And Keist was the same, only without the hair. So smooth, my fingers kept squeaking and sliding on his back. Beyond that, it's just anatomy. Some of it human, some of it not. Not worth talking about. I made tea once it was all over. I remember standing in the kitchen in my dressing gown, looking at my reflection in the kettle, hair choked up with sweat, little blotches of acne on my forehead that I didn't remember seeing before. Somehow, it wasn't the reflection I'd been expecting. By the time the tea was ready, Keist was in the living room again, acting like nothing had happened. I asked him whether he wanted whatever he said about not drinking. I thought maybe there were other urges he shouldn't have had, but did. He just shook his head, though. Quedge came home about 5 minutes later, and he was so busy talking about the kind of day he'd had that he didn't even stop to ask why I was wearing the dressing gown. 12. Isaac Summerfield, who was born in 2365 as the child of a 2-year-old toddler, had a confused kind of life. Which isn't surprising, I suppose. The scroll tries to be polite, but I get the impression he was a nervous, paranoid, messed-up person who spent most of his time being shunted from one space-age housing project to another. I think I've got more sympathy for him than any other Summerfield. When Isaac and his lover had a child in 2389, Isaac decided not to let the baby have a life anything like his and practically sold his offspring into slavery, handing the child over to the Earth military before the year was out. Isaac had called the boy Marshall Summerfield V, probably an attempt to bring back his family's glorious military past. But Marshall V turned out to be a pretty mediocre soldier who ended up not doing much at all in the Army's civil service. That might explain why the pendulum swung back again for the next generation of Summerfield, and Marshall V's son was called Dylan in the hopes that a bohemian life might suit the boy better than a military one. But it didn't work, because in 2455, Dylan's children were taken away from him, when it turned out he'd been sleeping around with non-humans, something you absolutely weren't allowed to do in the 25th century for some reason. Whether any alien blood got into the Summerfield line at that point, the family tree doesn't say. 13. One day I woke up in one of the guest rooms of the fortress. It took me a while to get a grip on the rock walls and the army-style bedsheets to work out which world I'd ended up in the night before. Quedge was already awake, but still naked apart from his Daffy Duck shorts. He was sitting up in the bed next to me, staring at the doorway. Keist was standing there, filling up most of the frame. I pulled the sheets over my body anyways. Keist looked at me, then at Quedge. For a while he didn't say anything. I wondered if something had snapped inside of him, if the wrinkly human parts of his body had remembered how to be jealous, if he'd come here looking for a fight. But what he said was, "It started." I looked at Quedge. Quedge looked blank. "The ghosts," Keist told us. "They've worked out how to use the operating system. They've broken through. They've got London." 14. There's something about the Summerfield line that makes the children want to be soldiers. Maybe something that started back in the 1950s when Jonah was called up for national service. Dylan's son eventually took up the old family trade and ended up as an officer in the Space Navy, or whatever it's called, winning medals at all kinds of battles with silly-sounding names. Maybe by coincidence, his name was Jonah too. And his son, another Isaac, kept up the tradition of recycling the same names over the generations. This Isaac Summerfield became an admiral, even higher up in the ladder than his father. The records say Isaac died in combat in 2543, although they also say he was still in active service as of 2595, so the AIs must have messed up something somewhere. The important bit is that his daughter was called Bernice. Not having the same fighting spirit as the boy Summerfields, Bernice ran away from the military and got herself a life as an academic, specializing in xenoarchaeology, something about aliens, the curse of Dylan Summerfield, and Martian history. But this didn't do her much good when, in 2596, the planet she lived on was eaten up by the gods. You see? With one act of unplanned procreation, Jonah Summerfield, 1930 to 75, set off this whole chain of events and cut a Summerfield-shaped wedge right through the middle of history. No wonder Keist was so hung up about sex. Just look at the damage it can do. It's a bloodline that never existed on Earth where I was made. A bloodline I'm not connected to in any way. So why do I feel attached to it? And why do I feel this urge to go looking for the remains of Bernice Summerfield? Notes on the horror. 15. It's funny. I'm lying on a deluxe, extra-padded, two-person, snuggle-up sleeping bag as I write this, so I can't feel the rubble underneath me while I work. I've been eating a month-old packet of biscuits as well, and I've just finished brushing the crumbs away. The funny thing is, I didn't just brush the crumbs away on the other side of the bed, the way I usually do. Somehow, I'm still expecting someone else to be sleeping there. It's like I'm waiting for Quedge to come back at any minute. Like the dent he's made in my life is so big, I can't believe the hole's not going to be filled in again. I'm running out of supplies, as well. I've run out of toilet paper already, because it's just not the kind of thing I stop to think about when I plan this expedition. This morning I had to start ripping sheets out of the back of the last notebook. If any future historians do read this, they'll probably think the pages were taken out to protect some terrible secret or other. How exciting. There won't be any secrets left, soon. Not now we're getting close to the end of the story. 1617. The three of us were hurrying down one of the spiral passageways inside the fortress. Down towards the room where the bottle was kept. Keist was dressing himself while he ran, doing up the buttons in his suit, hopping on one leg when he tied his shoelaces. How many of them are there? Quedge asked as he did the zip-up on his trousers. How many of what? Said Keist. The vortex things, on Earth. How many are there? One, Keist told him. Quedge looked disappointed. Like he thought he wasn't going to get the big fight he'd been expecting. I thought you meant, you know, there'd been an invasion. Keast sighed. It sounded like Venetian blinds rattling. He wasn't looking back at us, and I wondered if it was because he didn't want to look at me. Maybe he was still brooding about what had happened in the flat. The things from the vortex are in the operating system, Keast said, going over things from the beginning, as if we were too stupid to remember the details. Ever since we let them into the bottle, they've been trying to build themselves new bodies there. But they've been in the vortex as long as anyone can remember. They've been growing. Human bodies aren't strong enough to hold them anymore. Quedge finished doing his buttons up and did his best to look dignified. So? They've changed their strategy, said Keast. They built themselves one bioform, one body that can hold all of them, and now it's arrived on Earth. So all we have to do is kill this one big baddie, and the problem's solved. Keast stopped in front of us, blocking the doorway of the bottle room. He turned and fixed his eyes on Quedge, still ignoring me completely. I saw Quedge jump. Keast had locked his pincer fingers around Quedge's wrist. You still don't get it, do you? Keast hissed. You could see the contempt in those little blue eyes of his, the frustration of knowing he was the only one taking things seriously. The bioform. It's everything. Everything that's been lost in the vortex over the years. All the people, all the intelligence, all the machines. It's all of them at once. Said Quedge. So it's big, is it? Keast didn't answer. He let go of Quedge's wrist and stomped into the room, probably snorting to himself under his breath. 18. I haven't talked much about how the way the bottle looked from the outside. The first time you saw it, you could see all the stars twinkling away behind the glass, all the galaxies tumbling away from each other in what Keast used to call the redshift. But the view changed if you kept watching, like the bottle knew it was being looked at. Stare at one galaxy long enough, and the galaxy would fill the bottle. Stare at one star, and you'd see the whole star system, and so on, until you could see any room in any building in any street on any planet. Somehow, I always ended up spying on the people I'd known back in London, before Quedge had taken me away from them. Isn't that petty? A whole universe to explore, and all I used the bottle for was to watch Cal feeding LSD to whatever women he was trying to get off with, or pull faces at the blonde girl with the pale white legs who'd taken my place on Lady Diamond's beanbags. On the next day, the thing from the vortex broke through. The bottle wasn't working properly. Every time Quedge tried to look at London, the glass just filled up with black. Probably not a good omen. Keast told him that something was blotting out the employer's monitoring system as well, so nobody really knew what was happening down on Earth, except for the fact that it was big and terrible. Keast had already scrambled the troops at the fortress, and the plan was to send them through as soon as we'd worked out what kind of threat the men were up against. I suppose that meant Quedge was a kind of guinea pig, and the soldiers' tactics would depend on the way the monster killed them. But at the time, he must have thought he'd been chosen to do the one-on-one battle, and the thing just... He'd been chosen to do one-on-one battle with the thing just because of his prowess in combat. Poor romantic Quedge. And as for myself, well, nobody even bothered trying to stop me when I followed him into the bottle. Could we do it, though? Could we stop the horror in its track and prevent the imminent death of the world? Well, what do you think? 19. And on Earth? Across the world, news people were being told about the things happening in London, but not doing anything about it in case the story turned out to A, be a hoax, B, not important to anyone outside of Britain. In the north of UK, from Scotland to Birmingham, the regional TV stations for the next gap in the programs before waited for the next gap in the programs before they told the viewers of something was going on. South of Birmingham, in the places where London was supposed to matter, shows were actually interrupted to make way for the bulletins. The live racing programs were taken off the air, and the screens were filled with confused-looking newsreaders instead, who officially announced that nobody knew what was happening. In London itself, there weren't any news flashes at all. The normal TV stations were blanked out as soon as the thing from the vortex turned up in the city. The thing was a kind of hole in the bottle, a living thing gap between the worlds on the inside and the outside of the world. And don't ask me how the physics of that worked, by the way, because I don't know and I don't care. When the hole opened up, the two worlds suddenly found themselves rubbing up against each other, and all sorts of signals leaked into 1970 from the real universe. Across the capital, TV sets were picking up thousands of different channels, all of them broadcasting live from the 26th century, so the viewers must have found out the horrible truth that 600 years in the future, sitcoms wouldn't have changed one little bit. Meanwhile, people who tuned in to Radio 1 just to hear how Desmond Dekker was doing in the hit parade ended up turning into their parents as they listened to the kind of musics their descendants might make. If they'd been allowed to have descendants, anyways. And said to themselves, what is this rubbish? 2021. And on Quedge's homeworld, they had a computer there, which Quedge's employers used to keep track of everything they'd ever done, because if you can move around in time, then you've got to have some way of keeping everything in the right order. Quedge always said that whenever one of his employers died, his or her mind would be sucked up into the machinery, so the computer could learn more about the universe and make better guesses about the future. In fact, the computer was so smart that some people thought it controlled its users, not the other way around. Some of the rumors said that the computer would have existed even without Quedge's employers, and that the machine had invented the time traveler itself, just so it could be sure that it had been built. In which case, the computer must have been a lot like one of the gods, but never mind that now. The computer had things programmed into it. Special defenses which would be set off whenever it spotted anything going wrong in the universe, so as soon as it noticed the vortex thing had showed up on Earth inside the bottle, it sent signals to other time traveler stations around the universe, getting Quedge's people ready for the fight, whatever they happened to be. Wherever they happened to be. Halfway across the galaxy, there was a whole planet that Quedge's employers used as a prison. They'd snatched up some of the universe's most dangerous criminals and trapped them in blocks of ice, just like adamant. How this fitted in with their policy of non-intervention, I don't know. Maybe they just put away all the master criminals who looked like they were close to inventing time travel themselves, but one of those signals the computer sent out was aimed right at this prison planet. Through the whole of the prison, the ice started to melt, and the prisoners went free after all those years in cold storage. They didn't have much time to enjoy it, though. As soon as they'd thawed out, the warders of the prison stepped in and started to operate on the captives, injecting them with God knows what's poisons and bolting on God knows what extra bits and pieces. They were being turned into weapons, having their personalities cut out with knives and replaced with the time traveler's own programming. All that criminal talent was being put to a new use. At the end of the day, thousands and thousands of living, breathing machines were sent out from the prison, all of them capable of thinking up devious new improvements for themselves. Weapons that would evolve and grow over time, but they would always follow the houses. Of course, Quedge's employers could have done this years ago, but they'd thought it was inhumane, with their plans for the future of the bottle going so badly wrong, though the computer on the homeworld must have thought it was time for some action. Several hundred of the people weapons headed through space towards Simia KK-98, ready to move there in the bottle if things had got any worse, or to attack the Sphinxes if the kings of space thought the treaty had been broken. Some of this is based on what I was told after it was all over, but it's mostly just creative writing, which doesn't mean it's any less true than the rest of the book. 22. While all this was happening, me and Quedge were arriving back at the flat and meeting the control sphinx, who was squatting in the corner of Quedge's spare room. The sphinx had folded itself into smaller space than normal, Its head was tilted back at a funny angle on the end of its neck. "Error message. This environment has corrupted," it said when we stepped out of the passage from the real world. "We know," Quedge told it. 23:24. We'd left a couple of bags of shopping in the hall the day before, and Quedge scooped a banana out of one of them as we galloped out of the flat. He peeled it and ate it while we hopped down the stairs toward ground level, like he'd thought it would be dangerous to come face to face with the monster on an empty stomach. At any other time, I would have laughed. It's just not possible for a human being to keep his dignity while he's eating a banana. Nothing reminds you of your monkey genes faster than that. "Where are we going?" I asked him. We'd already reached the bottom of the stairs by then, and we were hurrying across the foyer of the building, past the broken lifts in the corners where the tramps used to sleep. The way I saw it, we had no way of knowing where the vortex thing was. I imagined Quedge driving through the London streets in his rented car, trying to follow the sounds of screaming bystanders. Said Quedge through a mouthful of banana. "He said it was in London. Has probably noticed all the holes we've been making around here. This is probably the weakest point for a breakthrough." "You mean it's our fault? Oh, God. You mean it's our fault it's here?" Quedge agreed. "So it can't be far away." He pushed open the big glass doors of the foyer and stepped out into the side street that ran along the side of the building. It was a good place to hang out, if you were a mugger or a graffiti artist. There was nobody in the side street when we got there, though. Then Quedge looked up. The sky was dark, and the stars were brighter than usual, which I thought was lucky, because the street lighting hadn't come on for some reason. The side street led to a wider road a few yards away, so every so often somebody would run past the end of the street, not even glancing at us when they went by. They looked like people trying to get out of the rain. There wasn't any screaming, that I can remember, although I could hear doors and windows slamming all over the city and car horns blaring at each other as the drivers tried to get as far away from the area as possible. Quedge headed forward, towards the main street. He kept his eyes fixed on the sky, and I stayed behind him, not wanting to break his concentration. Whatever it was he was concentrating on, by the time we got to the street ourselves, it was pretty much deserted. There were cars parked on the pavement, but none moving along the road. In the light from the stars, I could see faces pushed against the windows of the building, curtains and blinds rustling inside all the houses. A man with a mustache peered out from behind the shutters of a newsagent's on the corner. There was noise in the distance, cars and swearing pedestrians, but everything was quiet here. We were the only human beings stupid enough to be in the open now. Eventually, Quedge came to a stop in the middle of the road, still looking up and clutching the bottom half of his banana. He looked like that for a while, and I could hear the sound of his breathing even over the background noise. "So?" I said eventually. "Where is it?" Quedge didn't look down, but I could see his eyebrows twitching. "You mean you can't see it?" he said. That worried me. He was watching the sky, but I hadn't seen anything interesting up there, although having said that, there was something wrong with the stars. Even apart from the fact that they were brighter than they should have been. For London in October, they were moving, but only very slightly, wobbling from side to side, while I watched. You had to really squint at them to see it. In fact, it looked like the space around the stars was stretching, or maybe even breathing, moving in and out and in and... "I don't get it," I said. "Have you checked your watch?" said Quedge. 25. Quedge had given me the watch himself. Standard equipment, he said. It looked like an ordinary wristwatch, without even a brand name to make it stand out, but somehow it always seemed to know what planet I was on and which universe I was in. It moved its hands around to suit the local time, sometimes even changing the numbers on its face for the planets that didn't have 24-hour days. To begin with, I thought this might have just been a side effect of the time travel for watches to do strange things to themselves when you moved between time zones. But I don't suppose that makes sense, does it? It's one of those old space-age fairy tales. Clocks don't melt or start going backward if you go through a time warp. The universe can't tell the difference between a timepiece and any other lump of metal. At least, not unless the timepiece has been specially built by Quedge's employers. So why should it change the rules just to make the clocks go peculiar? 23 past, I've got, I said. In the afternoon, Quedge said. Yeah, I said. Then I looked up again, at the night sky. Oh, I said. Right. I wondered if that was what had scared the locals. The fact that the sun had suddenly gone out. But they were English, and they would have just put it down to a thing like bad weather. It was only when I saw the light, a huge yellow triangle of it opening up in the sky somewhere over Russell Square, that I figured it out. 26, 27. Oh, hang on, I need a drink. That thing over our heads, the big black space full of stars, that wasn't the sky. The sky was as bright as ever, lit up by the usual off-yellow London sunshine. The darkness was something else. Something that had come between the ground and the sky and blotted out the sun as far as the eyes could see. I told you, didn't I? The body the vortex things had built for themselves wasn't really a body at all. It was a non-body, I suppose. A hole. A gap in the universe the shape of a living thing, and through that hole we could see the universe outside the bottle. The stars were inside the horror. And no, I can't think of a better name for it than the horror, and yes, I'm going to insist on using a capital H. And we were standing right in the shadow of its stomach. I didn't realize until the light spread out over Soho, and I saw what shape the sunshine was. The light was shining down through the cracks between the horror's wing and the horror's body. I think I only really got my head around it when the thing reared up and looked down on us. Can you imagine that? The whole of space rearing up over you. On Earth there used to be people who had a fear of open spaces, a fear of being out under the sky, and I think the horror was the thing they were always secretly waiting for. When the night moved and flapped its wings, there was a wave of noise across the city. The car horns got louder, like the people had just been reminded why they'd been scared shitless in the first place. It was inside the operating system. That was what Quedge had said. I suppose he meant the things from the vortex had crept inside the rituals. The laws the Sphinxes had used to make body for themselves. Like the Archaeopteryx man we'd found in the quarry. The shape of the Sphinx was the template for anything that wanted to build itself skin and bones inside the bottle. So that's what the horror looked like, when it finally turned up on Earth. A Sphinx. A Sphinx so big that nobody could ever see it all from end to end. I remember thinking, before I really understood what was happening, it's wearing the sky. Wearing the sky the same way the Sphinx in Trafalgar Square had worn Nelson's lions. The light spread across the neighborhood, while we just stood there and gawped. The horror was shifting its attention from one part of the city to another. We could see the length of its neck, that huge black stripe over its head, speckled with the stars of the 26th century. When we'd arrived, we'd been in the shadow of its body, and the wings had covered the whole of central London. Now it was looking right down at us. Whether it was just taking in Soho as the whole, or whether it knew we didn't belong there, I don't suppose I'll ever know. 28. Another thing I'll never know is the death toll. There were plenty of reports in the days afterwards, but the TV and newspaper people were so confused by the whole thing that none of the figures sounded believable. Wherever you looked, the total had a different number of knots on the end. Sometimes I wondered how many people were mauled to death by the horror. When I asked myself that question, I imagined Lady Diamond's shopped, ripped in half by the fake sky. I imagined all the bodies in the wreckage. Lady Diamond finding out for herself what was on the other side of the veil of Anubis, or whatever afterlife she believed in that week. Dorian, with his face frozen mid-sentence, like he'd been reading out a poem to mark his own passing when the horror had finally got to him. That skinny blonde girl, torn to shreds. And serves her right, too. The bitch. Cal, dead in the wreckage. These are the things I imagine, but I know none of them are true. Even if the horror did take them all, there wouldn't have been any bodies left. There wouldn't have been anything. That was the way the horror worked. At the time I didn't even think about Cal or Lady or the state of the neighborhood. I remember staring up at the neck of the horror and being sure that this was the end, however you wanted to look at it. Even if the sky didn't fall and take us both, I knew that was the moment when I knew Earth was finished. Earth as I knew it, anyway. Keast, like the rest of Quedge's people, didn't give a damn whether the natives of the bottle knew about the aliens or not. Quedge had done his best to keep his presence on Earth a secret, to make it easier for him to move around, but everything changed on the day the horror came. Everybody in London, and soon everybody in the world, would get a chance to see the universe outside the bottle. From that point on, the Earth of 1970 was mixed up in politics of the places outside, just like I was. All I could think about, when I saw the horror start to drag its claws across the city, was that Quatermass movie, where the devil turns out to be a Martian and tears up half of London at the end. Britain made a lot of movies like that, between World War II and the end of the world. I must have watched London meet the apocalypse a dozen times before it really happened. Like we'd somehow knew the horror was on its way, and thought we could make it go easy on us by putting it in the movies. By the way, that movie is called Quatermass and the Pit, and I think it's actually a miniseries. It might have been made, it might have been compiled into a long movie, but Quatermass and the Pit, if you want to watch that movie. It's actually quite good. I thoroughly enjoy Quatermass and the Pit. 30. Whoever you are, whatever pretend world you live in, go out now, or as soon as it gets dark, and lie on your back with your face up to the stars. No, I'm serious. Go out and do it. And try to imagine that you're not really looking at empty space at all. Try to imagine that you're looking at one single thing stretched across the sky, blotting out the daylight. Now try to imagine there's a layer of glass on the other side of the wing, with a whole different sky behind it. Try to hold that picture in your head for a moment. The size of the horror, the tininess of the sky compared with what's outside. Now try to keep that picture in your head, so you know you'll never be able to get rid of it. It doesn't matter where you go, or what you do, it'll always be there. It'll always be with you. Good. I just wanted you to know what my whole life feels like. That's all. Notes on getting out while we could. 31. Somehow, we ended up in Leicester Square. I remember running, although I don't remember running that far. The streets were empty on the way, like the people of London thought they'd be safe if they put the chains on their doors and tried to watch everything happening on TV. Having said that, there were a couple of policemen hanging around the edge of Soho. They waved at us a lot to tell us which roads they thought were safe to run down, like it made any difference. There were people in Leicester Square Gardens, though. About 24 of them, crowded around the statue of Shakespeare, maybe hoping he'd be able to save them all with his witty 16th century wordplay. You couldn't see the shape of the horror at all from the gardens. The office blocks and cinemas made a tight square of the sky overhead, and if you didn't know better, you would have just thought it was nighttime. I think that was the way Quedge went to the gardens. I think that was why Quedge went to the gardens. He was looking for a place where he could focus on the horror properly, where he felt like he was standing right under its heart. I'd say it was all part of the ritual, but what do I know? He might have just been panicking. All I know for sure is that he made straight for the statue. 32. Shakespeare was standing on top of his fountain, right in the middle of the gardens. There was a pathway of paving stones leading from the gates to the fountain, cutting the lawn in half, and when Quedge moved along the pathway, the crowd actually parted for him. The people shushed themselves, quiet, when he went past. Did they know? Did they know, do you think? Was the world suddenly noticing that he was different, and that he knew something everybody else didn't? Maybe. Or maybe I just want to remember it like that. The people lined up in 2 neat rows on either side of the pathway, just like the armored men at the signing of the treaty. Not wanting to step on the grass, even in the face of the end of the world, when Quedge reached the statue and stopped right in front of the "There is no darkness but ignorance" inscription, oh, the irony, there was total hush, as if the crowds were expecting him to be able to shoo the horror away. Even so, his voice was so quiet that I think I was the only one who heard him. He looked up at the stars again and said, "You can hear me, can't you?" 33. I can't remember how long it took me to notice what was happening to the statue. I know I heard someone shrieking in Japanese, and suddenly there was a cracking noise, either like cracking ice or cracking bones. Shakespeare had been leaning against a big stone desk atop his plinth, but now one of his elbows was tearing itself away from the desktop. I'd say Shakespeare was coming to life, but that wouldn't be true. The thing that was inside him didn't care enough about human shapes to bother making the limbs move in a believable way, or to use the face muscles properly. As a kind of final insult to the English, Shakespeare shrugged his shoulders, and 2 huge stone wings exploded out of his back. The body kept twisting until the head, which the thing inside the statue obviously didn't think was very important, just rolled off the neck and shattered against the ground. With one moment, the statue leapt down off its plinth and into the fountain. I remember seeing its legs bending and flexing in a lot of different places, the same way spiders' legs move. One of Shakespeare's arms dropped off when his feet cracked against the marble. I think Quedge must have taken a few steps back when it happened. I know I did. "Sphinx," said Quedge, "is that you?" The other people around the statue just scattered. They scrambled off in all different directions, running for cover and dragging themselves over the railing of the gardens. Most of them stopped when they reached the edge of the square to turn back and watch, wanting to know what was going on without getting involved. You could see faces pouring out from doorways of the cinemas, ready to duck inside if things got too bad. The best picture show Leicester Square's ever seen. 34, 35. But me and Quedge just stood there, waiting for the Sphinx to get its act together. The headless thing flapped its wings, maybe getting a feel for the local gravity. When it spoke, its voice was as hard as its body. You could almost hear the cracks in it. "Statement. This unit is now slaved to the presence which controls the operating system," the Sphinx said, not out of any particular orifice. Quedge took another step back and trod on my foot. "It's getting its orders from that," he told me under his breath. By that he meant the horror. He didn't bother pointing at it. "Statement," said the Sphinx, and for the first time there was a kind of feeling in its voice. It sounded, well, cross, really. Angry is too strong a word. "Statement, statement." It sounded like it had forgotten what it was going to say. It turned on its spider legs, with its wings still twitching, looking around the square even though it didn't have any eyes. Finally it got a grip on itself. "Statement. This unit. We are here. Wait, the personality of this unit will be erased." The Sphinx started to straighten up when it said this, so I supposed it had remembered how to walk around in a human shape, even a headless one. "There. Now, talk? You wanted to me? Yes?" I wasn't looking at Quedge's face. Which is a pity, because I would have liked to see how he dealt with that kind of shock. "It's you," he said. "Yes," said the horror. "We talk. Talk. This is what you wanted, so..." There was a long, long silence, and Quedge didn't seem to know where to start. In the end, I cleared my throat. "Ask it why it's doing this," I mumbled. "Ask it why it's been killing people." Quedge must have thought it was a good question, although he rephrased it a bit, just to make it his. "What do you want?" he asked the horror. "Live," said the horror through its big stone lungs. "To be, to exist, forever spent nowhere. Let me out. Out now? Yes, here we'll live again. This new body, this new life." It took us a while to realize that it had finished. Quedge was shaking his head. "Not here," he said. "My people. We need the planet. It's important to us. You don't understand." "I," said the Sphinx. I was your people. Some of me were your people. Cracks between times. Trapped in. Have been your people in the past. No longer care. Will tear. Will kill. Hard to talk. Yes. So long since using language. Wait. I do not care. So I will live in this world. I will kill all other life here. Your plans are not important to me. Is true?" Quedge kept shaking his head, and I wouldn't have been surprised if it had dropped clean off, just like Shakespeare's. "That doesn't make sense. You said you wanted a new body, a new life. Well, okay, but not here. And why do you want to kill everything anyways? I mean, why bother?" I'm sure I saw the statue puff up its chest, like it was getting ready to breathe fire. "Vortex," the horror told us. "Pain. Nothing. Empty forever. Left to die. Left to live forever. No time at all. Nothing to hold me. Nothing to hold us together. Nothing but spite. We were left to die. No life. No respite. Why kill? Why not?" "Spite," said Quedge. "Is that it? You're just angry because you've been stuck in the vortex all this time?" "No," said the horror. "Vortex is angry. Nothing else there. I am not angry. This body is anger. Difference. Will kill. This body will kill because I want to." "No," said Quedge. He took a step forward towards the statue, and I don't think I would have stopped him even if I could have made a move myself. You could tell. You could just tell that he was getting all kinds of mantras ready inside his head. 36. A few days before the horror had turned up, Quedge had held a dinner party at his flat. It was the first time I saw the soldiers turn up on Earth en masse. I couldn't forget the way they looked when they stepped out in the spare room and into the hall. The way they turned their heads around, not being able to work out why this universe looked so different from the one they were used to. The same way you can tell the difference between a film made by the BBC and a film made in Hollywood, just by the difference in film stock. But you can't ever describe to anyone what the difference actually is. I say dinner party, although nobody wanted to eat anything, really. Really, it was more of a poetry recital. Quedge had invited the soldiers to Earth because he wanted them to see the way Earth worked, and learn how to use the rituals inside the bottle. I guess the men were probably the ones who were going to be part of the survival team once the crisis was over. So the aliens all sat around the table, and Quedge had set up in the living room, finding out about the mantras that could keep the sphinxes away. Sometimes the men would all say their mantras together, and things would happen. Objects would move across the table, or the corners of the living room would end up being in slightly different places. The way Quedge explained it, the words you said didn't really matter, as long as they got you to focus. Some of the guests at the table started using poems and songs from the planets where they'd been born, and some of them, the ones who'd become most like the machines, I suppose, didn't even bother with words. They screeched out a kind of code instead, which was probably quite pretty if you could slow it down and hear the numbers properly. By that time I had a mantra of my own. It was something I'd picked up while Quedge had been giving me the guided tour of the 26th century. I'm not exactly where I'd heard it, so for all I know it was just a nursery rhyme from the future, but it seemed to fit somehow. It went, "We make things out of skin, with blood and... We make things... Oh, we make things... We make things out of skin. We make things out of sin, with blood and human skin. We make things of dust so we can smash them up." 37. But a few days later, I couldn't imagine any mantra being good enough to make the horror go away. And as it turned out, I was right. "I can't let you do this," Quedge told the horror in Leicester Square. He sounded angry, and I hoped to God he wasn't just posing just because I was there. "Whatever it is you think you want out of this place, it's not going to happen, okay? You know what my people can do. If you want to hurt Earth, you're going to have to go through us first." The statue seemed to think about it for a while. It cocked its neck to one side, looking sorry that it didn't have a head anymore. "Fair," the horror told Quedge. 38. Later on, once they'd sorted through the wreckage, the local authorities told everyone that there'd been earth tremors across central London, that some kind of seismic trouble had opened up the ground there. It wasn't true, though. If anybody had bothered to measure the whole city from side to side, they would have found out that London had grown a bit wider than it had been. The horror had made more space inside the capital, and all the stuff that was already there had been shifted aside to make way for it. I didn't know that at the time, obviously. I remember feeling the ground moving under my feet. I remember falling, cutting my knees on the pavement stone, grabbing a hold of one of the metal benches near the fountain. Then I looked up, and saw that the bench had been cut in two. One half was there between my fingers, but the rest was on the other side of a gulf, a crack the size of a crack in the ground that had split Leicester Square Gardens right down the middle. The air was rushing in to fill the space, dragging everything that wasn't bolted down into the gap. The screaming had started again at the edges of the square, and the spectators were being pulled off their feet by the vacuum. I didn't look up at Quedge. Not at first. I just expected him to be there, like I always expected him to be there. I remember reaching for him, stretching my hand out toward the spot where I'd seen him last. But of course that spot was right on the edge of the gulf. The fountain had been cut in half, just like the bench had. There was no sign of the statue, or of the bits of broken head, and there was no sign of Quedge. I remember rolling on my back, letting go of the bench. I was staring up at the sky, seeing the stars breathing in and out over my head, a big black body of the horror rolling and rippling and... laughing? No, maybe not laughing. The people were still screaming, and one of them was screaming right into my ear, except that it turned out to be me, shouting at the horror and telling it that I wanted Quedge back, that I wanted London back, that I wanted my life back. The night was moving again, falling in on me, forcing itself into the gap between the cinemas of Leicester Square. The thing was starting to claw the ground, raking London with its front paws. 39. Later on, the authorities found out that the horror had hardly left any rubble in the parts of the city it had wrecked. Wherever it had put its claws, the architecture had been sucked in by its body, along with anybody who'd been in its way. What happened to all those people and buildings? Did they end up outside the bottle, floating through empty space somewhere in the 26th century? Or did they go to a vortex of their own, between the two worlds? If they did, then there must be whole suburbs of London still stuck there, drifting around until the end of time. Eternal suburbia. Not a nice thought. From what I heard afterwards, Leicester Square was almost completely scratched off the face of the earth. I would have gone too, I should think, if I hadn't been rescued. 40. Personally, I still can't think of it as being a rescue. I remember lying there on my back, with the stars getting closer and closer, screaming at the horror, no, the world, to take everything away and let me start my life over again. Then there were shapes standing over me. One of them looked down, and I realized it was Keist. But I didn't care. Keist wasn't what I needed. I kept screaming, even when Keist knelt down and put his arms around me. That makes him sound so soft and sensitive, doesn't it? But Keist was a piece of lifting machinery. That's all. A bulldozer with a face. I remember when he hoisted me up. I don't know what I was fighting. I just kept kicking. And I remember hearing his skin squeak when I clawed at his chest. The face was only a couple inches away from mine, so I could smell his skin, all sweat and chemical and iron fillings. He didn't look down at me. "Back to the station," he said to the other soldiers he'd brought with him. They'd come to save me. They must have done. There was no other reason for them to be in Leicester Square, but at the time I think I would have been happier if I'd been dropped down the crack in the ground. A couple of moments later, Leicester Square wasn't there anymore. It had been taken away from me, and a completely different kind of world had been put in its place. The world Quedge's employers had built in Earth's orbit. Like waking up from a dream, that moment of feeling sick and annoyed when you have to move between one life and another. 41, 42. There was a ceiling over my head, a brown rock ceiling, so for a moment I thought I was in Quedge's quarters back at the fortress. I must have thought I'd been asleep, and that Keist was some kind of weird leather armchair I'd gone to sleep in. Then I was being moved again, shaken up and down while Keist's feet clanged against the floor of the station. Yes, the monitoring station. The little lump of Earth history that had been floating around the planet for about 48 hours now, fooling the astronomers into thinking it had always been there. I'd seen the inside of the station before, on the day it had been finished, so it wasn't hard to figure out where I was. It was made out of the same stuff as the fortress, and there was the same living feeling inside the rock, like it had hollowed itself out as part of some biological function or other. I must have stopped screaming at some point. I saw Keist look down at me, but he didn't make eye contact for more than a second. I got the feeling he was embarrassed by me more than anything. Perhaps he was, after all. I'm sure it was his employers who told him to risk going down to Earth with a whole mini army of his men just to pick me up and carry me off to safety. Did he feel responsible for me? Because of Quedge? Or because of what had happened between us? I'd like to think that. But to be honest, I don't think Keist was human enough. Only in a romance novel would a supercharged war machine feel guilty about a one-afternoon stand. "You can put me down," I told him. My throat had been scraped raw by all the screaming, and I still didn't know how I'd ended up at the station. Alien teleporter technology, probably, but I was starting to get my head together. Keist didn't look down at me. "You're hysterical," he said. "I'm fine," I told him, trying to sound tough. "Even after what happened to Quedge?" Quedge. I remembered the ground cracking open in more detail than I'd actually seen it. I think. I could imagine Quedge falling into the hole with the statue tumbling after him when the scream started to come back again. I had to clench my teeth and pretend it was a cough to stop it getting out. "I'm fine," I said once again. Keist probably didn't believe me, but he stopped anyway, and let me stand on my own 2 feet. Somehow I'd managed to stay upright when he let go. "Don't get in the way," Keist said. "That's all." 43. From the outside, the station looked like a great big pebble, hovering just around the atmosphere. It hadn't been built to look attractive. The only reason I know it looked like this is that I saw a picture of it on my first visit there with Quedge. Is picture the word I mean? I'm not sure. The control room of the station, and that's just my name for it, but then I've seen too much Thunderbirds, was a cave, dome-shaped, like the hall in the fortress and where the clones were made. But the rooms were full of spheres, 3-foot-wide glowing ones that hovered just a few inches off the ground, just like the map of Earth time I'd seen back on Simia KK-98. All of the spheres were supposed to be pictures of Earth, but they all showed it in a different light. Some of them were like ordinary maps, marked out with the biggest energy sources on the planet, or earthquake stress lines in the rock. Some of them were maps of time, showing Earth's history from every possible angle, if history's got angles. There must have been at least 30 of the spheres, all arranged in a ring around the wall of the dome. The middle of the floor was kept clear and decorated with a mosaic. One of the time traveler's holy symbols, I'm sure. The first of the spheres that Quedge led me to was a straightforward view of the planet in 3 dimensions, although I had no idea where the camera might have been to take a picture of that like that. You could see the station floating above the Earth, a tiny speck of dust over Africa, trying to look innocent whenever it thought Patrick Moore might have been looking up at it. 44. After Keith left me in the corridor on the day of the horror, the control room was the first place he headed for. By the time I stumbled into the dome after him, it was very nearly full, and the space in the middle of the floor was seething with bulky blue-gray bodies. The soldiers were inspecting the spheres and muttering in machine talk, exchanging notes on how things looked through their own specially grown eyeballs. I found Keist again, in the middle of a bunch of armored men who still had their own faces. They were eyeing up one of the time maps. I peeked around the edge of Keist's tank body to get a better look, but it was as if he saw, but if he saw me, he didn't show it. I was a persona non grata again. They were watching the time contours of Earth. But if the last time map I'd seen was anything to go by, things weren't looking good. A lot of the map had turned black, and the blackness was spreading, moving along the contours like a spark on a fuse wire in a Bugs Bunny cartoon. I didn't know whether that meant the horror was actually getting bigger, or whether it was just eating away through more and more of the past. I wondered if it'd be turning up in the sky all over all the big events in world history. If everyone from Winston Churchill to Jack the Ripper, if there's that much difference, would be looking up from their work and seeing the night come down early. "Impossible problem," one of the men said. He sounded like the scientist I met at the fortress, although it's hard telling one insect mutant from another. "What you're asking is, how do we go up against the universe we're living in?" "It isn't all of the universe," somebody else said. I had one of those Alice in Wonderland paranoia moments, and I didn't turn round to look at the man in case he turned out to be a talking sheep or something. I could practically hear Keist grinding his teeth. "But we've got weapons we can use?" The scientist looked dubious, as much as he could with a face like his. "Not exactly. We've got rituals. We could try to sabotage the operating system." How long would it take?" snapped Keist. 45. I don't think Quedge's employers were religious, as such. I talk about time travelers having holy symbols, but I think they were only holy in that way, say, John Kennedy was holy. Leftovers from a time when people still believed in believing in things. Once, though, I saw something in one of the caves on Simia KK-98 that made me wonder. There was a queue of armored men, and they were lining up in front of what looked like a machine gun. They were just strolling past it, letting themselves get sprayed with bullets. Some of the men weren't even scratched, but the others, they rebuilt themselves, to make sure they were tougher than before. Their idea of self-improvement, obviously. It made me think of those monks in medieval days who used to flog themselves, stupid, to get closer to God. Because as far as Quedge's employers were concerned, the soldiers weren't just making themselves stronger. By turning themselves into machines and getting rid of all the things that wouldn't have suited the time traveler's program, they were making themselves pure. Notes on the Dead Heart. 46. There are all kinds of theories about where the gods came from. especially now you can't go anywhere in the 26th century without hearing about them. Most of the popular theories are about ancient alien super races leaving behind reality warping machines, but some of them are more exotic than that. One of the weirdest ideas was thought up by Professor Bagarius of Loughborough University, who was one of the few people to have bothered studying the gods before they invaded Della. According to the professor, it's kind of inevitable that we keep running into things like the gods in the universe. He said that back on Earth, human beings used to see mystery animals wherever they went in the world, and I can vouch for that, because it was the same even inside the bottle. There were supposed to be sea serpents in all the big lakes, and missing link-style ape men in just about every forest on the planet. Whether those animals were real or not isn't important as far as the professor's concerned. The important thing is this. There's something in our brains that can't help seeing monsters, even if the monsters are obviously impossible. And when people finally went out into space, all of a sudden they had a pretty much infinite canvas for drawing their mystery animals on. The people of the universe had to invent the biggest monsters possible. Basically, the professor's idea was that the gods are just a side effect of us being alive. They have to exist to fill up that big black space in the universe that our imaginations kept focusing on. Of course, I don't believe any of this. Partly because it sounds like the work of an acid head, and partly because my own theory about the gods, I'll come to it, trust me, is confusing enough already. But to be fair to the professor, it'd explain a lot. It'd explain why the professors are always so in tune with everyone's bad... It would explain why the gods are always so in tune with everyone's bad dreams. Why so many people who've met the gods' servants wake up in the middle of the night yelling, "No, no, not the rectal probe!" Might even explain why the horror, made by god technology, remember, didn't just act like the end of the world, but looked like it too. Lying there in Leicester Square Gardens, I must have felt the way Chicken Licken felt when he, or was it she, figured out that the sky was falling. No wonder I couldn't stop screaming. 47. It was only there in the control room of the station, surrounded by Keast and his scientist soldiers, that I really started to feel useless. Yes, these people were talking about my whole world, but so what? It wasn't like I felt connected to it anymore. Earth had gone and replaced me as soon as I'd run off with Quedge, and now Quedge was gone as well. Oh yes, Quedge. I remember making a noise that would have been another scream if I'd let it out. The soldier-stroke-scientists were too busy talking about weapons and strategies to notice. So I started to move away from the group, not exactly sure where I was meant to be heading. As it happened, I ended up drifting towards the other side of the hall, to the place where Quedge had shown me the picture sphere of Earth. The ordinary one, with all the continents and oceans where they were supposed to be, and all the clouds taken away so you could see what was happening. If you could even see Britain, as a little blob of green rock on the edge of Europe. Except that you couldn't. Not anymore. None of the armored men around the hall were interested in something as boring as a normal picture, even if it was in 3D. So I was the only one standing in front of it. Europe was turned towards me, although there was nothing but black over where England was supposed to be. On the map you could see the horror as a blob the size of a blue bottle, stuck to the outside of the globe. You could even make out the details of the body, the wings covering most of the land south of Birmingham, the tail thrashing about over the channel, just to scare the French. You could even see the face, or the space where its face was supposed to be, which meant that it was looking up. For a moment, I honestly thought it was looking at me, but no, of course not. It was looking at something else, something that had moved away from Africa and was now hovering right over Europe, a tiny speck stuck in the planet's orbit. I started to think about the old cat Cal used to have, the way he'd stare at the rats and kept getting into his room through the whole... Stare at the rats that kept getting in the rooms. Oh god. I started thinking about the old cat that Cal used to have, The way he'd stare at the rats that kept getting into his room through the holes in the floorboards. The cat would just sit there, watching every move the rats made, knowing sooner or later it had to catch the bastard sooner or later, but couldn't make up its mind about when. I screamed. This time everybody listened. While the soldiers started clustering around the sphere, the horror reached up over the curve of the planet and headed straight for us. 48. From the outside, this is the way things must have looked. The pebble was still floating on the edge of the atmosphere, but you couldn't see much of it anymore. There was something wrapped around the rock, so dark that it blended in with the empty space behind it. The horror must have been about the same size as the station, from head to tail. Now it had all 4 of its legs, wrapped around the rock, opening up spaces in the walls and sinking its claws into the corridors. The station did its best to deal with this. It squirmed and wriggled, trying to grow new lumps of rock over the holes the horror had made, but not having enough raw material to fill all the gaps. Inside the walls, it did everything it could to make sure its passengers stayed in one piece, keeping the air pumping and the floor level, no matter how much the horror shook the place. 49:50. 5 minutes later, I was lying face down in the corridors, pushing myself against the wall and trying not to go deaf from the sound of the soldiers' fleet clanging against the rock. Once everyone had noticed that the horror was heading for the stations, the battle tank men had thundered out in the control room in their dozens, manning whatever battle stations they thought might be worth manning. Me? I'd been caught up in the stampede, clinging to the arm of one of the men when he'd stomped out of the cave to stop myself being trampled to death. He hadn't even noticed me as he dragged me along after him. The soldiers were getting to grips with things now. The horror had already chewed away the parts of the station that handled transport and communications. Clever, clever horror. Stranding the men on the rock with no way of getting back to Earth or calling for help. After that, they'd apparently realized that manning the battle stations wasn't going to make any difference, and they all headed towards the middle of the station, just to get out of the horror's way while it squeezed the walls. I decided to lie low. There wasn't much else I could do, so having gone through all the trouble of making this decision, I was kind of annoyed when something hard and sharp pressed into my neck, and I felt myself being pulled to my feet. Keist was standing next to me, not letting go of my shoulders in case I couldn't stand up on my own. "Come on," he growled. "Why?" I said. I didn't know why I was arguing. Maybe I just wanted to annoy him. "We're setting up a ritual," he told me. "We're going to try calling in the Sphinxes, get their help shutting down the operating system." I could tell just by the way he said it that this plan of action wasn't going to work. The horror controlled the bottle, so it wasn't likely to let any Sphinxes in from the outside. I didn't point this out at the time, though I just yelled at him to let me go. Keist crunched his teeth together, like all of this was one inconvenience too much. "I told you not to get in the way," he said. "You're slowing us down." Which was when I snapped, frankly. I hadn't asked for any of this. I'd been pushed into this lifestyle. I'd been pushed into caring about what happened to the bottle. I'd even been pushed into this stupid corridor. I wasn't going to let this tiny-headed twat tell me what a nuisance I was for being there, especially not after everything. So I hit him. Flat palm right against the shoulder. It was never going to do any damage, but I felt my hand bounce off his skin. Felt like plastic, even though it looked like metal. And I saw Keist flinch, like there was some programming in his body telling him not to hit back, and he was trying not to act on it. I hit him again. Kept hitting. Or rather, I kept flapping my arms, and some of the punches reached his body, while some of them just made me sweat more. Keist kept glancing over his shoulder all the time, wanting to follow the other men up off the corridor. Or maybe he was worried what they'd say if they saw him getting into a fight with a puny earthling. Finally, he dropped me. I collapsed onto my knees when I hit the floor, but I think I managed to make it look deliberate. "You can't stay here," Keith said, and his voice was flat as ever. "Fuck off," I told him. He spent another few seconds staring at me, before he turned on his heel and stamped away. Moments later, he was gone into the not much safer rooms deep at the heart of the station. 51. There were still armored men trundling past me, but they'd thinned out now. The last few were hurrying away from the walls where the horror was breaking in. I stood up and I pulled myself together, composed myself. Brushing the hair out of my face. The men were veering around me, but apart from that, they hardly noticed I was there. Even so, I tried not to look stressed. Despite the fact that there were sweat stains the size of the Lake District under my arms. And despite the fact that yesterday's makeup was already turning into sticky black splotches all over my face, I could just feel it. There was no way off the station. There was no way of getting away from the horror. I was not, absolutely not, going to do as Keist said, just for a few extra minutes of surviving. I turned and I stalked off down the corridor towards the outer walls of the monitoring station, still keeping my nose up in the air, heading out for doomsday with dignity. See? Romantic to the last. Knowing what I know now, I would have just slouched the whole way. Why not? 52. I'm sorry if I get distracted sometimes. I don't usually remember things in the right order, and besides, there are plenty of things to distract me here in the ruins. For example, I just searched through my rucksack for another pack of biscuits and ended up pulling out a photo that's been lying at the bottom of the sack ever since I left London. It's a picture of a city, stretching off into the distance, all spiky pyramids and shiny domes. There are sphinxes and dragon boats everywhere. One of the sphinxes in the foreground, wrapping itself around the nearest spire, turning its head toward the camera. All very psychedelic. I remember taking that photo with the magic instant camera from the 26th century, which I've lost since then. I remember wondering whether the Sphinx was eyeing me up or just posing. I wish I had some glue. I could stick the photo to the front of this notebook, or maybe the inside cover. I could say it was an author's photo. After all, this is the story of a whole little universe, and the Sphinxes were the ones who built it. It's their story. I'm just the one who gets to hold the pen. 53. Back on the monitoring station. I turned a corner. Well, I turned lots of corners, but only one of them was important. The one I turned just before I got to the outer wall. I panicked when I saw it. I've got to admit that. The wall at the end of the corridor had vanished, leaving behind a wide-open space, full of stars and not much else. I remember shutting my eyes, expecting to get sucked out into the void. Nothing happened, though. It was only after I'd opened my eyes again that I remembered. I was looking at the space station. I wasn't looking at the space station. I wasn't looking at the space outside the station. I was looking at the skin of the horror. The passage had been split open right down the middle, and the horror had slipped one of its big black claws into the gap. I wondered how easily the thing could have killed everyone here just by opening up space all over the station. Instead, it was physically tearing the rock apart. Why? I don't know. Why do humans enjoy popping bubbles on that see-through plastic packaging you used to get in hardware shops? Because it's satisfying, I suppose. I couldn't hear the soldiers' footsteps anymore. We were alone. Just me and the horror. I took a few steps forward until I was inside spitting distance of the claw, watching the stars whirling around in front of me. I cleared my throat. "Hello," I said. 54. What did the horror sound like when it spoke? It was like all the people on the planets inside it were opening their mouths at the same time, making whatever buzzing, squawking, or chattering noises they felt like making. I know this can't have been true, because the horror was really just a hole between universes, and the stars were stars of the universe outside, but that's not how it sounded at the time. It told me it was listening, in more words than my head could take in at once. I think it actually paused when I talked to it, breaking off the attack just to hear what I said, I don't remember exactly what I told it, but I was probably gabbling. I hope to God it didn't sink to the level of saying something like, "Can't we talk about this?" Although I can't be sure. All I know is that once I'd finished, I heard it in all of its voices. All I heard all its voices say four little words. In. Come in now. Which is how I ended up putting my best foot forward and stepping right into the horror's body. The first human woman to walk in space, and without a suit, too. Eat your heart out, Buzz Aldrin. 55. Imagine this. You're walking into a planetarium, like the one they used to have in Marleybone, except that this planetarium's a sphere, so you can see in all directions, including down. Don't ask what you're walking on, it isn't an issue. Once you're inside, you get the feeling that this isn't really a planetarium at all, that you're actually seeing the whole of space, live as it happens. But you're seeing it in so much detail, you're sure this isn't the same as just lying under the stars on Box Hill with a bottle of cider. You start tracing the constellations across the sky, seeing the patterns marked out by stars, although after a while you start to realize that the shapes are actually there. Space is made up of shapes. Shapes of all sizes, and, well, shapes. But they're alive. Some of them look like people. Some of them look like machines. Some of them even look like animals. The clever thing is that all of the outlines are locked together with no gaps between them. Somehow, all the different things have fallen into the vortex over the years, have been slotted together, like they were part of one big cosmic jigsaw. And I mean cosmic in the way Lady Diamond would have meant it, Natch. Much cleverer than the Escher pictures of the salamanders. There are other patterns, too. You think about the things Quedge used to draw on chalk on the floor in the spare room. Yes, you've got all my memories to play with, don't worry. And you can see the same kind of patterns in the sky, huge glyphs and pentagrams joining up the living constellations. You figure out that these patterns are what hold the sphere together. All the things here rotate and revolve inside the loops and webs of the patterns. This, you tell yourself, is the heart of the horror. The operating system of your entire universe. Or is it a bit too cosmic? It didn't strike me that way, but then again, I was trying not to suffocate at the time. 56. I tried to fall on my knees, but there was nothing underneath me and nowhere to fall to. I wanted to breathe in. I couldn't. My lungs were tearing themselves to bits inside me, and I could see blood vessels popping in front of my eyes. "Air," said the universe. "You need air, yes?" When the air flooded into the space around me, it got sucked into my body so fast that it practically lifted me off my feet. I kept gasping, kept taking it in, just as we went away again, while I wasn't looking. "Now," said the horror. "Talk?" 57. Some of the shapes I could make out in the night sky, which had fallen into the vortex over the years, and ended up as part of the horror. 1. People. Lots and lots of people. A lot of them had probably been Quedge's employers while they'd been alive. They looked human, but I got the feeling you could see them in any number of ways. You looked in any other number of ways if you looked hard enough, so I didn't. 2. Human people. I didn't know how close the humans from Quedge's time had come to inventing time machines, but I guess the humans here were victims. Bystanders who'd got caught up in the time traveler's politics and paid the price for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Some of the humans in the constellations recognized me as one of their own and started swearing at me in funny accents. 3. Aliens. Use your imagination. 4. Machines. Time traveler probes that had been sent into the vortex and never come back, and had started to grow there, finally turning into things that could call themselves smart. What a way to be born. One machine looked especially important, because it had tentacles everywhere, squeezing between the outlines of all other shapes. I was told later on that in the 25th century, some supercomputer or other had been dropped into the vortex during a duel with Quedge's evil renegade, so that was probably the thing I saw. While I was there inside the operating system, I got the feeling this was the thing which had brought the horror together, the thing which had joined up all the other ghosts and given them one voice to speak. 5. A whole. 58, 59. When I finally got my head back in order and worked out that I could breathe again, I realized I wasn't alone in the planetarium, meaning that there was someone else standing in the middle of it all. Somebody I could at least deal with on my level. Not like the rest of the vortex things. I could see a man-shaped hole in the constellations behind him, so I guessed that he was one of the ghosts and that he'd stepped out of the wall to talk to me. He was armored, like the men back on the station, although he was smaller and less bulky. I got a feeling that he hadn't been evolved, for total war. And the armor wasn't exactly the same style as Keist's. It was jet black for a start, and his head actually looked rather like a helmet than a face that had grown new parts. Like an old pharaoh's death mask, but less fiddly, more streamlined, without most of the features. 2 slits for eyes, and that was about it. The armor was battered all over, covered with scar tissue in a lot of places. For some reason, I got the feeling the damage had been done when the man, whoever he was, had been sucked out of time and into the vortex. One of his arms was all twisted and gungy, crippled by the accident. My first impression? That he was one of Quedge's people, but some kind of renegade. Not the evil renegade himself, but maybe one of his followers. A soldier from an enemy faction, one of the bad guys. Then again, I might just be saying that because he was dressed in black. I must have asked him who he was. He answered in his own person voice, but it was obvious the horror was talking. We can't communicate properly, the man said. He sounded English, although most of the aliens I'd met sounded English, and I don't know how that worked. Not as a whole. Too many thought systems operating at once. Too many words. But you're the horror, I asked him. You wanted to talk, said the man. He sounded smug and self-satisfied when he said it, which was probably his own personality at work, or whatever was left of it. This is the only way you can understand us. If we use this mouthpiece. So, what do you want? I want to understand, I said, and maybe it was true. Why are you doing this? Doing what? Doing what? I waved my arms around, tearing everything up. London, the station. The world, the horror added. The universe, everything inside the bottle. Yeah, that. Why do it? I told your friend. With spite, with anger. That's all. The horror shook his head. The one he was currently using, anyways. We've been in the vortex. We've been trapped there since... No, linear time doesn't work there. You might as well call it forever. Do you have any idea what there is in the vortex? Nothing, I guessed. Less than nothing. The understanding of nothing. I could tell him he was having trouble explaining himself even in this body. When we were alive, we believed in things. Even the ones who didn't have gods of their own. We believed in our societies. We believed in principles. Then we saw the way things look from inside the vortex. We saw everything in its proper context, and there is no proper context. Does this make sense in your language? He sounded fragile when he said that. For a horror the size of space, anyway. I tried to nod. I don't remember what he said next. Not word for word. But I'll sum it up. And I'll try to put it the way I imagine the horror putting it, whether it happened like that or not. Existential angst, as told by the horror, and filtered through Christine Summerfield. 60. Everything is meaningless. No, it's worse than that. Even calling it meaningless puts it inside the context of meaning, and there isn't one. Wait, let me explain. You draw in information about the universe around you, through your eyes, through your ears, or through whatever other senses you were born with. Your nervous system starts building webs to catch the raw data, filtering the information, shaping it into something that looks as if it makes sense. All of your principles, all of your beliefs, all your laws, just your filters, ways of dealing with what you see and hear and sense, of forgetting how small and amoral your life really is. And when people get the same filters together, that's what you call your culture. Civilization is a filter, a romance, a lie, if you like. And we always knew it was a lie, even before we ended up in the vortex. I think everybody knows it on some level, but the fact we were civilized meant that we could cushion the shock and get on with our lives. It's different once you've been in the vortex. Once you've seen how small the romances are. Once you've had your nervous system ripped out and lost all your filters. All those ideas about philosophy and society and ethics. You asked me a question. You asked me why. The answer is why not. It's only when you've had your culture taken away from you that you realize a good answer, why not, what a good answer, why not really is. See? And now, we are going to take our first break. So, if you're listening right now, feel free to take a moment to relax. I'm going to set up the casting thing. My brain's not working. Stand by. And we'll be back after these not messages. And we are back. Well, we've probably got another 2-ish hours to go. We're halfway through, literally, because there's only 120 pages for this chapter. And we'll see how long some of them are, because some of them might be quite short. But I'm glad I reread this before I did my show. It's been reminding me about a lot of the great themes, and particularly some of the visuals I'm going to have to create on stage. Or at least imply on stage as best we can. But I'm not going to bore you with yammering. Let's get going. Notes on me and the horror. 61. I heard that kind of talk before. In a way. The horror sounded just like Dorian. Dorian who skim-read every book on philosophy in the LSE library. And there weren't many. Liked to tell people that all life was meaningless, and that free will was an illusion, and that God was definitely dead. He generally did this to prove how clever he was, compared with, say, the College Christian Union, and to justify writing poems about the coming of the Angel of Death. None of which ever really convinced me. Because even though this was always my argument, even though Dorian usually ignored it, if life really is meaningless, and there really isn't any free will in the universe, then you might as well be a happy fucker as a miserable one. What I'm getting at is, in that a pointless, empty universe, a good time is as meaningless as a bad time, so you might as well just slap on a smile and get on with your life. Personally, I'd never been able to do either of those things, but that was just my problem. 62 to 65. These pages are headed, My Conversation with the Horror. Again, I don't remember exactly what I said, But I think I must have told this to the horror. Once I'd finished, the man in black armor just nodded. Yes, he said. Yes? Yes? I said. What do you mean, yes? Yes, you're right. It isn't built into the laws of the universe that we have to kill everything. So why do it? I asked. I got the feeling I was going around in circles here. Because we aren't happy either, the horror told me. Because the anger's all we have left. You didn't used to just be anger though, did you? You used to be people. I could swear I heard the other ghosts buzzing at me when I said that. You always know when you're on the wrong side, when you've said the wrong thing, don't you? You want us to be human again, the black armor man said, looking down at me through whatever nose he might have had. Yes. Well, yeah. Not possible. Not after the vortex. We don't have any humanity left to give you. I wasn't convinced. So how come you're talking to me now? Instead of wiping me off the station, I said. Doesn't that mean you must still be a little bit human? Sniggering from the other shapes. No, it couldn't have been. We don't mind talking, said the horror. We've got all the time in the world. Besides, you may say something interesting. Not that it'll stop us. All right, so what about the time travelers? They won't just sit back and let you take over the bottle, will they? They can't hurt us, said the horror. Not here. If they want to fight us, let them come. We'll be happy to kill them as well. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't being funny. This was the way he saw things. I thought about Keist, permanently locked into macho mode inside that big metal skin of his. There was no backing down, as far as Keist was concerned. The power struggle between the time travelers and the horror, or between the time travelers and the gods, or between the time travelers and anybody else who wanted to fight, would carry on until one side beat the other into submission. The horror had the same kind of hang-up about it. But that's just it, I said. But that's just it, I said. I was pacing the planetarium by now, not looking down, in case I started to ask myself what was holding me up. It's all so stupid. Look, the last couple of weeks, I've been hanging around with Quedge, yeah? I had to pause after I said Quedge, thinking about the ground opening up in Leicester Square, but that wasn't important now. For God's sake, keep your cool, Christine. Keep breathing. Breathing. Ah! He's been showing me this universe. Showing me the way things work. Like the pyramids were built by aliens, and there are these green men on Mars, and Jack the Ripper was... Listen, the point I'm making is... Took me a few moments to work out exactly what point I was making. Things are just so simple there, I said. So basic. It's like the siege they had, when the Sphinxes turned up at their fortress. It all came down to the big face-off, and yeah, the face-off might have ended in a big fight, or it might have ended in some treaty or something, but the point is that there was one big scene and it was all over. It was all resolved. Is this making sense so far? Yes, said the horror. Only I think things might be getting a bit complicated here, I said. That's all right, said the horror. I'm more intelligent than you are. Fine. The thing is, I keep comparing that with the way things work back in my world. Back in my version of Earth. I kept talking, even though I had no idea the horror was bothering to listen. Look, I used to hang around with this guy called Cal, right? We had sex a couple of times, and it was like, after we'd done it, there was this kind of feeling there. Like something had changed, and we couldn't get over it. I mean, we'd say we'd just going to be friends and everything, so that should have been the end of it, but it was like nothing ever got resolved. Because things like that never get resolved. Everything keeps hanging around, and most of the time, it just gets worse. Sex isn't important to us, the horror pointed out, making me realize for a moment how far I'd come in the last few weeks to finding myself describing my sex life to the angel of death. Yeah, I guessed, I said. But the point is, things are different where Quedge comes from. Where you come from, I don't know why that is. Maybe it's just because the Sphinxes left so many loose ends behind when they built all the stuff inside the bottle. In Quedge's world, everything always gets sorted out, you know? Things always end up in a big face-off. I think that's why Keist can't deal with me. Because he got involved with someone from inside the bottle, and he keeps expecting the stuff between us to get resolved. But I'm sorry, I'm just rambling now. Yes, agreed the horror. If it really was just anger, he must have been the slow burning kind, because he seemed happy to listen to me spouting off. I suppose you don't need to rush things if you're immortal. All I'm saying is that this fight between you and the time travelers, it just looks stupid. I mean, it looks stupid to me. This big life or death struggle you've locked yourself into, this whole last man standing thing, things don't work like that. Not in the real world. I realized what I'd said as soon as I'd said it. All right, I blurted. All right, things do work like that in the real world. That's exactly how they work in the real world. But they don't work like that in my world. And I'm not saying, and that's all I'm saying. Not inside the bottle. That's why it looked wrong, right? All right? You turning up all over London like that. It was like the end of the world was coming, and we're not used to seeing stuff ending. No loose ends. No fallout. Nothing. Have you ever seen Quatermass? No, said the horror, not sounding particularly bored or particularly interested. Well, I said, I was finally running out of steam. Well, that's what I'm saying. We don't do things that way where I come from. The way things work in your universe isn't important, the horror told me. I thought about it for a moment. Hang on. You are in my universe now, remember? The horror looked puzzled. Probably. Think about it, I said, and I knew I had no idea what I was going to say next. I was letting my mouth run on automatic. You said you're just anger. That's all you are. That's all you are. Just spite, yeah? The horror nodded, so I kept talking. And how do you know you really want to kill everyone? How do you know that's what'll make you happy? I mean, happier. What else is there? Asked the horror. I thought about telling him to take up golf, but I decided against it. That's what I'm getting at. You don't know about the way this world works. You don't know what it's like to live here. All you know is this stupid face-off. So you're saying... I'm saying you've already made up your mind about what to do with the bottle, even though you haven't got any experience with it. Look, there's more to this than just the big climax, all right? Things aren't that simple around here. The horror sounded like he was picking his next words carefully. Let me see if I'm following you. You think I should try to understand life in this universe before we remove it. Is that right? If you like, I said. I've already told you. Humanity isn't important. Oh, fuck humanity! At this point, I started remembering all the philosophical arguments I had in Cal's flat, and some part of my brain started searching the planetarium for an ashtray I could lob. What I'm saying is, this stupid agenda of yours doesn't belong here. You just haven't seen enough of the place to know it. All right, said the horror. That threw me. What? I said. All right. We don't seriously believe we're missing anything by not getting involved in this world, but we're prepared to listen. We're not in any hurry. You'll listen? I said. Somehow this wasn't what I'd been expecting. We're anger, said the horror. Anger is all we are, but anger might be different here in the bottle. It might be less straightforward, as you said. So teach us. I had no idea how to teach a thing like that, and I said so. It'd probably be going too far that the horror looked disappointed. Oh, he said, in that case. In that case, we'll just have to carry on killing everything. Wait, I said. Wait. So the horror waited. I spent another minute or so pacing the non-floor, and he didn't interrupt me once. Okay, I said in the end. I've got an idea. 66. The horror was quite happy to answer my questions. It told me if it could take on any form it liked if it tried hard enough. Just like the Sphinx on Earth had worn the statue of Shakespeare, the horror could climb into any shape or even make new shapes of its own by shifting space around atom by atom. That was what the Sphinx had done back in Lady Diamond's shop, knitting itself into a Manson-sized body based on the images it picked up from a quick survey of the culture. The horror told me that this kind of thing was fiddly, but possible if you had the patience. At first it hadn't been able to get the process right, hence the Archaeopteryx man we'd found in the quarry, but now it was rooted in the operating system. It could do just about anything. My idea was this. I told the horror it should build itself a new body, say, the body of a baby human being. If it wanted to do things properly, it could even build itself a family, just to make the whole thing more convincing, then squeeze itself into that body, and spend half a lifetime on Earth as a human, learning about the world the way a human would have done. Obviously, it'd have to adjust its brain so it forgot it was really an immortal monster and everything, but after about 30 years on the planet, as a normal person could get, 30 years on the planet, as a normal person, could get its old memories back and crawl inside the operating system again. This time, with all the cultural knowledge it needed to make a proper decision about the future of the bottle. I was halfway through explaining this when it suddenly hit me. If it wanted to, the horror could probably just learn things much faster by taking my own brain apart, which is something it was almost certainly smart enough to do. I got around this problem by telling the horror that, quote, the knowledge won't be any use to you unless you experience it yourself, end quote. Either the horror was taken in by this, or I accidentally made a really good point. Of course, there was a hidden agenda here. The bottom line was this. I hoped that I'd be spending 30 years as a human being. I hoped that by spending 30 years as a human being, the horror might get back its lost humanity and decide that making people happy might be a better idea than killing them off in their billions. But the horror spotted this secret mission of mine straight away and pointed out that since it would remember being in the vortex once its human body hit 30, this wasn't very likely. Still, we've got to live in hope. 67. The story is starting to make me think of The Wizard of Oz. You know how there are two worlds in that movie? The real world, in black and white at this time, and Oz? And you know how all the characters in the black and white world have got counterparts in the fantasy world? Well, let's just say that if this book ever gets turned into a movie, you can cut the cast list in half with no trouble at all. Quedge and Cal could be the same person. Or Keist and Dorian. Or Lady Diamond and the Sphinx. Or me and the horror. It's an idea. So, 68. So, a quick note here about my own philosophy. Like a lot of people who grew up in the 60s, I personally wasn't sure whether the human race was such a good idea. Like Dorian, like Cal, like all the others, I went through the apocalyptic teenage deadhead stage when I thought that the best thing humanity could do was wipe itself out in a nuclear war and let the insects have a turn. Obviously, I grew out of it once I got to 18 and the spots cleared up, but there in the planetarium, the figure of my whole bottled race was in my the future of my whole bottled race was in my hands, and nobody else's. Did I, at the time, wonder why I was bothering? Did I ever ask myself whether it wouldn't be a good idea to let the horror wipe everything out just for the sake of it? Well, yes, I did. Maybe that was the plan. Maybe that was what made me think of the plan. About the horror having a trial run at being human. I was putting a kind of random element into things. Basically, if the horror human had a good time, then the world might pull through. If the horror human had a lousy time, the world didn't stand a chance. See? I was getting things out of my hands, letting the world judge itself by the way it treated the baby horror. Maybe there was even some spite of my own in the mix. Me secretly hoping that baby horror would have as crap a time as I thought I'd had, just to teach the world a lesson. As it turned out, I needn't have bothered. Things were about to get pretty random anyways. 69. There was a long pause after I'd finished explaining the plan, while the horror mulled things over. We're not sure, the man in the black armor said in the end. But you said it yourself, I told him, trying not to choke. You're immortal. You spent forever in the vortex. I mean, 30 years is nothing to us, the horror agreed. No time to wait. Well then? The question is, why should we wait at all? That stumped me, I've got to admit. We might be missing something in our understanding of the way this universe works, the horror went on. We might be, but we're probably not. We're not sure we should bother wasting any more time. We're not convinced there's enough to be gained from it. He went quiet after that. It took me a while to work out what was happening. The whole of the planetarium was waiting for me to say something else. The ghosts had thought about it, and I'd told them, and they decided it made sense, but it wasn't enough. One more sentence would make the difference. Just a few more well-chosen words, and they'd give the world another 30 years of life, or maybe even leave it alone completely, if things went well. All I had to do was say the right thing. Suddenly I couldn't think of anything. I opened my mouth, went, and then I realized I was going to say something really stupid, and that if I did, it'd be the last really stupid thing the human race ever came up with. Why couldn't I think, for Christ's sake? What was I supposed to say? How was I meant to know what the horror wanted to hear and save every man, woman, and child on planet Earth? I felt my mouth hop open again. There was only one thing I could think of, only one thing I knew to settle an argument once and for all. Do you know how to play stone, paper, scissors, paper? I asked. 70. I only worked it out afterwards. The horror had sent the black armored man to talk to me because it knew that that was the best way of communicating. The horror might have been bent on mass destruction, but it wasn't stupid. The point is that I could have picked any method at all of finishing the argument, and the horror would have accepted it, because it was ready to do things on my terms, at least for as long as I was there inside the planetarium. I could have decided to flip a coin, or challenge it to a game of Cluedo, or even start a debate about modernist French poetry, but I chose stone, scissors, paper, and there, in the heart of the horror, it was as good as any way of doing things as any. 71. The man in black armor knew how the game worked. Or if he didn't, then one of the other ghosts must have whispered the rules in his ear while I wasn't looking. We both held our hands out, ready to play. We were just about to start shaking our fists when something struck me. Wait a minute, I said. Let me get this straight. If I win, you'll go along with my plan. Otherwise, you'll kill me and everybody in my universe. Yeah? The horror nodded. True. How do I know you'll keep your side of the bargain? If I wanted to, I could just read your mind and win automatically, the horror pointed out. But that would defeat the object. Right. One more thing, okay? Is this game going to be on the first shake, or is it best out of 3? Best out of 3, said the horror. Why not? 72. There's an art to playing stone, scissors, paper. A kind of rhythm. You both clench your fists, and then you try to move in time with each other. You shake your fist once, you shake your fist twice, you shake your fist 3 times. Then you push out your hand in whatever shape you've chosen. Clenched for stone, 2 fingers for scissors, flat open for paper. You wait until the last possible moment before you change the shape of your hand, so you get at least a 1% chance of spotting what the other person is going to do. So that's how things were in the planetarium. Me and the horror fixing our eyes on each other's fists, moving in perfect sync, playing for the world. 1 shake, 2 shake, 3 shake, hands out. I looked at what I'd chosen. 2 fingers out. Scissors. The same thing I always chose to start off with. Even before I said anything, my eyes were drifting over the horror's hand. Still clenched. Stone blunts scissors, said the horror. For a moment my stomach was in a completely different dimension. Best of 3? I croaked. That's what we said, the horror agreed. 73. First round to him. I tried to work out what that meant, probability-wise. 2 more rounds to go, and I had to win both of them. Did that mean I had a 1/3 chance, or a 1/4 chance, or bollocks to it? Not important. 1 shake. I could go with scissors again. No, because he'd probably go for stone again to bluff me. Paper then. Except he might see that coming, so he'd choose scissors, so 2 shake. So stone it is. Except the way he's shaking his head. Does that look like he's going to choose paper? Alright, cancel everything out. Suppose it's paper. If it's paper, I need scissors. But he'll be expecting scissors, so 3 shake? To hell with it. Sheer blind luck. Hands out. Scissors, said the horror. I looked down at my fingers just to make sure. Scissors, I said. A draw, the horror pointed out. We play the round again. I said. Still losing. Still a point behind. Are we going to keep getting draws? Be here forever? There's an idea. Stall him so Keist and the others can work out some kind of way of 1 shake. Oops, I wasn't thinking, was I? Help. Okay, what did I pick last time? I picked paper, so 2 shake? No, I picked scissors last time, and the time before. Ha! He'll be expecting me to pick scissors again, and I'll pick paper, so I'll beat stone to beat paper. 3 shake? Wait, that's not right. If he thinks I'm going to pick scissors, then he'll pick stone, which means... Christ, what does it mean? Hands out? A paper wrap stone, said the horror. At first I didn't know who'd chosen what, because my eyes were shut. I opened them again, one at a time. I'd chosen paper, he'd chosen stone. Final round, said the horror. 75. 1 shake? Last round. Maybe the last round ever. All of Earth's future hangs on this. All of the people, Cal, Dorian, Lady. Does that matter now? Quedge is gone. Lost in space. What about all the others? People, animals, insects. 2 shake? No insects to take over. Nothing. Nothing but the horror. Damn, what was I thinking about? Stone, scissors, or paper? Was it last time? I chose 3 shakes. Paper! That's it! Paper! No, I'm not meant to choose paper. I meant to choose... Ah! I said. The horror looked down at his fist, then at mine. He'd gone for scissors, and I'd gone for... nothing. I hadn't gone for anything. I'd frozen, just stuck out my hand without making a choice. My fist was still clenched, which looks, for all the world, like a stone. I looked up. The horror was the same expression, was the same as ever. No expression on his masked face, no feeling there at all. You win, he said. We agreed. Ah, I repeated. Notes on the aftermath. 76. I'd like to have seen it. I'd love to have been watching the sphere in the control room when the horror broke away from the station. It must have stretched its wings, turned its head on the end of that long, long neck, and started spiraling back down towards the planet, shrinking as it went, exiling itself to Earth, at least until the year 2000 or so. It must have been, well, spectacular, I suppose. But I was standing in the corridor at the time, watching the hole in the outer wall seal up, so you'd never have known the horror had even been there. In the end, I was staring at plain brown rock in an empty, stuffy, badly lit passageway, which was a bit of a come-down after all I'd been through. 77. Before we go any further, let me tell you one thing. Quedge wasn't dead. I mean, he didn't die when the horror opened up the ground under London, and for all I know, he's still alive today. I'm telling you this in case you think I'm trying to build it up into a surprise, with Quedge suddenly turning up again on the last page for a happy ending. There isn't going to be one, but he survived anyways. After the crisis was over, Keist took me back down to Earth. I stood with him on the edge of the gulf in what had once been Leicester Square Gardens, while a couple of the other men sorted through the rubble that was at the bottom of the crack. The hole wasn't as deep as I'd imagined it, i.e., it wasn't bottomless, although the drop was still pretty lethal. From the edge we could just make out the wreckage 10 yards below us, all the bits of metal piping and electrical wire that had been exposed when the crack had opened up. All the things from the surface had been sucked down into the gap. We couldn't see Quedge, although the men in the crack told us he was there. He was probably trapped under the statue of Shakespeare. I remember glancing at Keast while we were stood there, but his face was as hard and grey and lifeless as it always was. He didn't look at me, probably because he didn't think I was important enough to look at, even if I had saved him and all his people from the horror. There weren't any locals around. The cinemas and the shops were gone, sucked up by the horror. While we'd been on the station, you could see the stumps of the building wherever you looked. So the horror must have swept its claws over the whole area, taking away everything more than a yard above the ground level. People included. I should think so. The men bought Quedge up on a stretcher, which floated about a foot or two over the pavement without anybody having to carry it. Quedge's body was covered in growths by then, little blobs of white fungus, like the thing that had healed up my leg. Quedge didn't look like Quedge anymore. He was a big, tattered rag doll, a great lump of scar tissue held together by mushrooms, or is that a mixed-up metaphor? I could just about see his eyes through the blood and the growths, but they were closed. He would have died if the men hadn't gotten to him. I suppose I could have asked them to help some of the other people who'd fallen into the crack, but to be honest, I didn't even think about it. By then they weren't important to me any more than they were important to Keast. 78. Technically, I suppose you could say that the incident between me and the horror was just another face-off, like the ones I'd been taking the piss out of while I'd been in the operating system, but I think I get points for saving the world with a game of rock, paper, scissors. This should have been the end of the story, really. The horror had been seen off, Earth was sway, if a bit shaken, and Quedge was alive. Little did I know that the horror would turn out to be the biggest red herring in the history of the world. The real horror was still 5 days away. 79. After the mess had been cleared up, Quedge's employers let him stay on Earth instead of calling him back to Simia KK-98. I don't think either of us ever saw the monitoring station again, although over the next few days, Keast kept dropping into the flat to keep Quedge up to date on the progress of the survival plan. Keast always made me leave the room before he'd talk to Quedge. I still don't know whether anything personal happened between them, anything to do with me. Knowing Keast, I doubt it was even an issue. Quedge was up and about 48 hours after his near-death experience. On the morning of the 9th of October, I found him walking around the living room in his dressing gown, trying to get his legs back in full working order. Most of the little fungal growths had either dropped off or sunk into his skin by then, but you could still see tiny scars over his face and hands, like the gaps between the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. When I walked into the living room, he was staring down at his feet and mumbling to himself. He looked and sounded like a grumpy old man. The television was on in the background. After the crisis, the BBC Two had pretty much become an all-hours news channel, clearing most of its schedule to report on any findings about the horror. Or, to put it in BBC talk, the tragedy. They couldn't find a better name for it than that. If a UFO had turned up in the middle of London, the TV people would at least have some idea how to cope with things. But the horror just wasn't the kind of alien they'd been waiting for all those years. When I walked in on Quedge, Kenneth Kendall was hosting a debate between a leading American psychiatrist and an official from the Church of England. "You need more rest," I told Quedge. But Quedge didn't listen. All I could hear him say under his breath was, "No time. No time at all." 80. I stuck by the stretcher after Quedge was pulled out of the hole on the 7th of October, while the armoured men waited for the station to teleport them out of the atmosphere, where they apparently had better medical facilities. Keast had wandered off by then, so I was the only one left to do the love and comfort routine. The men clearly weren't going to bother. I thought about squeezing Quedge's hand, but his hand was covered in lumps of sticky white fungus. I think the only one who noticed him opening his eye. I think I was the only one who noticed him opening his eyes. I couldn't see most of his face for the blood, but he looked scarred anyways. I heard him take a deep breath. "It's all right," I said. "It's over." Not very sharp, I know, but what else could I say? Quedge tried to talk. It took him a while to get his tongue moving, and when he finally managed it, he had a lisp, thanks to the cuts and bumps on his lips. "Where did it go?" he hissed. I told him. I must have kept blathering, giving him all the details. I probably got the scenes in the wrong order back then, too. "So, it's human?" he grunted. I tried to look reassuring and normal by smiling at him and playing with the ends of my hair. "Mm-hmm. It's on Earth somewhere. I don't know where." The growths on Quedge's face started to stretch. I figured that he was probably smiling, although it must have hurt him to do it. "Good," he said. "Good we can find it. It must have left traces. Find it while it's still human. While it's vulnerable." "I don't think so," I said. Quedge blinked at me. It must have been the only movement he could make without damaging himself. "Leave it," I told him. "Just leave it alone, and don't try to end it with another face-off. Please." For the first few moments, Quedge didn't move. Then he closed his eyes. I think I saw him nod before he collapsed back into unconsciousness. 81. Quedge had been a policeman before he'd been recruited. The legendary, good, loyal, honorable cop. He must have known how important it was to stick to your word. I'd never actually promised the horror that Quedge's people wouldn't come after it while it was human, but that was kind of implicit in the deal we'd made. Implicit. What a great word. I never confronted Quedge about it. Not head on. I think he was embarrassed that he'd even talked about going after the horror. Maybe there'd been a time when he'd been younger, when he wouldn't have needed telling to leave it alone. Quedge had fallen a long way. An omen of what was going to happen next, maybe. 82. Quedge and I never had sex again after the days of the horror. It's funny, but that's never occurred to me before. Officially, it was just because of his injuries, because it wouldn't have felt right to end up fucking when his whole body was being held together by mushrooms. But underneath it all, I don't think that Quedge wanted the attention. He was restless after the 7th. He wouldn't stop moving. He'd be walking in circles all hours of the day, trying to get his body in shape again. He tried to read the papers, but he'd get fed up with having to concentrate and end up going out. At 9 o'clock on Sunday evening, we were sitting in the living room watching Laurence Olivier in some play or another. ITV, unlike the BBC, was ready to pretend the tragedy hadn't happened. When Quedge suddenly told me he was going for a walk, I didn't argue. "Do you want to come?" I asked. "Do you want me to come?" I asked, hoping he'd say no. He did say no. He pulled his raincoat over his shirt and walked out of the living room and shut the door behind him. It was a good 10 minutes before I heard him opening the front of the flat, so I guessed he'd felt the need to pace up and down the hall for a bit just to get his legs in the mood. He'd been doing that a lot recently. I got bored of the play after that, and turned over the news on BBC One. It was a minute before I got sick of it. I couldn't listen to any more stories about the horror, not without shouting, "Isn't it fucking obvious?" at the screen. I turned the TV off and wondered whether I was starting to pick up Quedge's itchiness. He was trying to distance himself from me. You could tell. And seeing as he was the only thing I had left to hold on to, this made me as restless as he was. After a while, I decided that I'd go for a walk as well. I'd find something else to fill up my life, just in case Quedge dropped out of it altogether. As ever, Coke seemed like a good answer. 83. At that time of night, you couldn't walk for more than 5 minutes in London without running into a policeman. The local authorities had drafted in extra forces after the tragedy, signing up anyone with military experience as a temporary police officer. They didn't have uniforms. They just had armbands with the letters SC, Special Constabulary? I'm not sure. Printed in white letters on the blue fabric. The SC people were covered the city, forcing pedestrians away from the parts that had been leveled by the horror, and generally keeping order in a dad's army kind of way. I must have seen half a dozen SC people between the flat and Covent Garden. I didn't think any of them would have cared about a lone, no-goodnik looking for action, but I kept my head down anyways, tucking my hands into the pockets of my duffel coat and trying not to splash through any puddles in case it had been made illegal while I'd been off planet. It had been raining for days, so people were starting to wonder whether the horror had done some kind of permanent damage to the sky. I walked past a man selling the Evening Standard at the Covent Garden tube station, and saw that Charles Manson was on the front page again. The paper had managed to squeeze together the two big stories of the day, as Manson had apparently claimed to be responsible for what had happened in London, or connected it with it, anyway. The prosecution lawyer, old Mr. Vincent Bugliosi, had always said that Manson was expecting the end of civilization. The thing the British had seen was, in the great maniac's opinion, a taste of things to come. I was so wrapped up in thinking about this, and in trying to resist buying a copy of the paper, that I didn't realize where I was going until I got there. I was in Covent Garden proper, back in Lady Diamond's neighborhood. More importantly, I was close to home. Close to my real home, that is. The one Chris Quedge had been keeping me away from for the last 2 weeks. 84. Manson wasn't the only one getting messianic. So much had changed during the 60s that a lot of people had just told themselves that the horror was all part of the process. The older generations must have thought the youngsters had somehow called it down to earth, with all their drugs and pop music and casual sex, and they were right, in a way. After all, Quedge's employers had only chosen Earth in 1970 because of our love for all things foreign and mystic, remember? I say Earth. I probably just meant London. For all I know, they hated foreign mystic things on the other side of the world, and never bothered asking. The tragedy was the burning issue of the day. All of a sudden, it was the only thing people had to argue about, which meant that all the old political lines had to be redrawn. In the days after the 7th of October, both Ted Heath and Harold Wilson tried to dance around the question of what had caused the horror, knowing that anything they said on the subject could ruin their chances at the next election if it turned out to be wrong. England was crawling with foreign officials come to check out the scene of the crime in case it turned out to have anything to do with the Russians or the Chinese. And from Baghdad to California, there'd been other sightings of the horror. People claiming to have spotted patches of the night sky just like the one over Britain. Unless the horror had children that we didn't know about, they must have been imagining things. Now, more than ever, Britain must stand united, Mr. Heath told the nation on Friday evening, between Wheel of Fortune and Gunsmoke. We are one people, and we have all crawled from the shadow of this terrible, terrible thing. He was grasping at straws, and everyone knew it. Meanwhile, it only took Watch Out magazine 2 days to come up with a "What I Was Doing When the Tragedy Happened" article in which they asked just about every second-rate celebrity in the building where he or she had been when the horror had come. Most of them said indoors. Forget what the Archbishop of Canterbury had to say. This was the real meat of the issue. 85. I don't know exactly when I decided to go back home. By the time I'd reached the flat, my flat, I'd already forgotten about the great cocaine hunt. All I wanted was something to fall back on, if Quedge decided to leave me behind and home was as good as anything. If my old world didn't want me, I'd make it want me. After all, I knew things about it that nobody else knew. If all else failed, I could always try blackmailing it. The flat was on the ground floor of a big Victorian building off Endell Street. The building had been walled off in half a dozen smaller living spaces, and the rent was pretty low, mainly because the place wasn't technically safe to live in. Cal had found the flat, and convinced me, the landlord, that a bunch of dropouts with a bad pot habit couldn't really make the building much less stable. 3 of us had been living there ever since, spending most of our spare time saying that we couldn't stand each other and that we'd move out as soon as we could be bothered to get proper jobs. There was nobody in the street when I got there. I was close to the part of WC2 that the horror had sucked up, so most of the old residents had moved out just in case it came back. There were roads cordoned off all around the neighborhood, but none of these SC people were showing their faces. So at around 11 o'clock on the 11th of October, I found myself standing on the doorstep of a place I remembered, calling home 2 weeks and a whole lifetime in the past. Somehow the "We do not buy door-to-door" sticker in the window didn't look as welcoming as it should have done. Nor did the terracotta tiles on the steps, which had been cracked across when Cal had dropped a fridge on them the day we'd moved in. I didn't have a key on me. I thought about ringing the bell, then remembered that if anybody was in by this time of night, they'd probably be too stoned to bother answering. I think I read in the TV Times that Tom's Jones was on ITV until closing down, and Tom's Jones was supposed to have been one of the celebrities on Manson's hit list, so I can imagine Cal and Dorian and the rest of the peer group being glued to the screen for that reason alone. I remember swearing. I'd come all that way, walked the distance back to my own world, and I wasn't going to give up now. 86. I should have given up. The world would have ended anyway, but if I hadn't broken into my old flat, then I would have never figured out the truth. I wouldn't have known what was happening until it was too late. Oh, who am I kidding? I'd probably be dead by now. And yes, I'm sure it'd be the proper thing for me to say that I'd rather be dead than know the truth, but I'd be lying through my arse. 15 minutes later, I was hurtling through the streets of Covent Garden again, pushing aside anyone who got in my way, police or otherwise. I remember running around in circles, breaking through a couple of the cordons, getting much too close to the parts of London that weren't supposed to be there anymore. Quedge had spent 2 weeks keeping me away from the place. I remembered calling home. He'd been subtle about the way he'd done it, or as subtle as Quedge could get, and now I found out why. I'd run face first into the twist in the plot. 87. This is what happened when I went back into my old flat. Breaking in wasn't the problem. There was an alley by the side of the house between 2 of the big Victorian buildings, and there was a window there that led into the kitchen. There hadn't been a lock on the window when we'd moved in, or even a catch, and we hadn't thought it was worth fitting one since we didn't have anything worth burgling, except for Cal's record collection. I knew you could get into the house by forcing the window open from the outside, because we'd done it once before, when Dorian had deliberately dropped his keys down a grating in an effort to loosen up and make himself less paranoid about losing stuff, if you can follow the logic of that. The kitchen was the same as it has always been, although the smell of grease was worse than usual, and someone had been using paper plates, probably just to avoid doing the washing up. The paper plates were lying around in heaps around the pedal bin, like someone had tried to frisbee them into the bin from across the room. Nobody was around. When I walked out of the kitchen and into the hallway, nobody was around there either. The house was empty. It had that feel empty houses usually have when you can tell, even without looking properly, that there are no TV sets or radios switched on anywhere inside the building. I called out, just in case I was wrong. No answer. I started to wonder if everyone had evacuated the place after the horror had come, or if they'd been standing too close to Leicester Square when it had been leveled. I never did find out the answer to that one, either, but it's all academic now. 88. I started to get worried when I walked into my bedroom. As soon as I opened the door, I knew it hadn't been left alone in the fortnight I'd been gone. All of the things I recognized as mine were there, but they weren't in the places where I remembered leaving them. Dirty sheets scrunched at the bottom of the bed, and clothes I hadn't worn in the last couple of months hanging over the armchair. Some of the drawers were half open, which wasn't unusual, but there was something wrong about them. like they'd been opened in a way that weren't normal, in ways that weren't normal. Does that make sense? I sniffed the air. It smelt of girl sweat. It smelt of me, but the smell was more recent than it should have been, and somehow it made my nose itch. I wonder if the cocaine had finally broken something in my nostrils. I moved into the middle of the room and started touching things at random just to get a feel for the place. Then I started fiddling around with the bits and pieces, shoving things back into the drawers, or folding up the skirts that had been left on the floor. Not that I really cared how neat the room was, but I wanted the world to know it was mine. Except I couldn't get over the feeling that it wasn't mine, even though I remembered everything there. I ended up standing by the bookshelf, tutting about at how few books there actually were, and rearranging the decorations. The little stone gargoyle I had bought on an expedition to Camden, the crystals Lady had given, or sold, as everyone else in the world would have put it, to me, in the hope that they'd clear up my karma. There was a stack of photos on one of the shelves, and I started neatening up the pile without even thinking about what I was doing, which is when I finally noticed. 89. I don't have any of the photos with me now, which is a pity, because they'd make nice souvenirs. They were all in black and white, and had all been taken in the summer of 1969, when me, Cal, and half a dozen others had all taken a coach to Aberdeen for a week to look at stone circles and pretend to be impressed. The top picture of the stack was of me and Cal standing in front of a wire fence with a great big stone archway in the background. I was grumpy that day, and I looked it. Cal was stoned, and he definitely looked it. At least that's what the picture should have shown. But it wasn't me hanging around in front of the megaliths. Yes, I think I must have actually jumped when I saw it. It was somebody else. Another girl. She was standing right where I'd been standing, wearing the kalug that I'd been wearing, and Cal was leaning on her for support, the same way he'd lent on me. I stared at the picture for a while, trying to remember where I'd seen the girl before, the same age as me, but a bit taller, blonde, skinny legs. Lady Diamond's place. Of course. The last time I'd tried to go home, I'd seen her through the glass in the door of the shop, lounging around on one of the beanbags. Back then I'd thought she'd taken my place, whoever she was. I hadn't been expecting her to take over my past as well. For the first few minutes, while I stood there, and stared and stared and stared at the photo, that's honestly what I thought. I'd left my own world, so the universe had slotted a new girl into the space I'd left behind, even letting her take over the bits of my life I'd already lived through. It was only once I'd gotten over the shock that I started to put everything together. All the loose ends, all the things I never got round to asking Quedge, all the holes in the story. That's when I figured out exactly who the girl was. That's when I dropped the photo, and that's when I started running. Notes on the truth. 90. I might as well say it now, seeing as you'll be working it out for yourselves soon anyways. A lot of this book is, strictly speaking, lies. The parts about Quedge are true, of course, and so are the bits about the horror and the sphinxes and Quedge's employers. It's the little details about my friends and family and my early years that are suspect. Remember what I told you back at the beginning? Remember, I'm making a book out of my memories. I can't swear that any of these memories are anywhere near to the truth. If I tell you that I fell off a horse at a children's zoo when I was 6, or that I lost my virginity to Cal when I was 15, then I'd just be telling you things the way I remember them. Am I getting too philosophical here? I'm sorry. I just don't want you to think I'm a liar, that's all. Because I don't feel like a liar. 91. At around 20 past 11, on the 11th of October, 1970, I ended up back at Quedge's flat, with my hair full of sweat and a stitch in my side the size of the Suez Canal. There was nobody in when I got there. I didn't even bother to look. By then, I think I'd worked out what Quedge wouldn't... I think I worked out that Quedge wouldn't be coming home. Besides, the card he'd rented was missing from its space outside. The first thing I did was go to the kitchen. I knew I could find some old tools there, a couple of spanners and a bunch of rusty screwdrivers stuffed into the cupboard under the sink. I'd seen them while I'd been trying to clean up the place on one of those mornings when shitty housework seemed like a better option than jetting off across the galaxy with Quedge. By the look of them, the tools had probably been left behind by the last tenants of the flat, who'd had no idea at all that the next occupier would be working for aliens. I picked up the heaviest spanner, and then went out into the hall and headed straight for that one door I'd never seen Quedge open. Yes, the one with the padlock. Living here for the last fortnight had made the door so familiar to me I'd stopped wondering what it was. Until now, of course. Now I'd started to figure things out. Question. Why had there been such a long gap between Quedge leaving the living room to go for a walk and me hearing him open the front door of the flat earlier in the evening? He hadn't really been pacing the hall, had he? He'd been doing something else, something in here, in the secret room. How did I know all of this? Because I did, that's all. Because it was the only thing that made sense, which is why I started beating at the door with the spanner, first trying to break the padlock, then giving up and trying to beat a hole in the wood paneling. 92. This is the list of all the questions I started asking myself while I was running back to the flat after I'd found the photo of Cal and the blonde girl. 1. If Quedge's employers could get 1 or 2 people into the bottle by copying the Sphinx's ritual, then why had they bothered sending Quedge in at all? Couldn't they have just used the rituals to send their survival team straight to Earth, one traveler at a time? 2. Was it really a coincidence that the person who got mixed up in Quedge's life just happened to have the same surname as one of Quedge's oldest and apparently deadest friends? 3. According to the arrest report, which Quedge had nicked from the police station after the Sphinx had turned up, Quedge had been carrying something that looked like a murder weapon on the night we'd met. Why? 4. And exactly how had the horror managed to kill 2 innocent women on the street of London if it hadn't worked out a way to build itself a proper body by then? And finally, the one thing that had helped everything else click into place. What was behind the locked door in the flat? 93. The room turned out not to be lit once I'd smashed my way in. At least, it wasn't lit in the normal way. Most of the room was kind of dark, but there was a kind of blue glow in the middle of it, which somehow didn't manage to light up the walls, the floor, or the ceiling. I climbed through the hole in the door, cutting my hands on the splinters, but not really caring. I was sweating like a pig by then, and there was an itch behind my nose that wouldn't have been fixed by all the coke in South America. I was prickling all over by the time I reached the blue glowing thing. I was getting close to the truth, and I wanted to stuff as much of the truth into my body as I could by snorting it, smoking it, or injecting it. Anything to make me whole again. The thing in the middle of the room looked like a tank of water, but there were little blue bubbles of light frothing up in front of my face. I knew even before I touched it that it wasn't a tank. It was just a cube of liquid, like the tank I'd seen on Simia KK-98, where Quedge's employers grew their clone things. There weren't any naked bodies floating around inside, but the cube was big enough for at least 3 full-sized adults, maybe 4. I put my fingers against the side, just close enough to hear the words that had been programmed into the tank, to feel the memories stored in the water. The water told me how it had fallen off a horse at a children's zoo when it was 6, and how it had lost its virginity at 15. It told me about Cal and Lady Diamond and Dorian's bad poetry, and by the time I moved my hand away, I knew whose personality was being kept inside the cube. I remember being calm, there in the locked room. No point getting violent now. I could have tried lashing out at the tank or throwing things at it, but I knew anything I hit it with would just end up being a part of me. I think I'd already figured out where I had to go next, even before I'd finished thinking things through. 94. What's the first thing I remember? The first thing I remember is a book of fairy tales I had when I was 18 months old. I remember there being a picture of a fox on the first page, dressed up in a top hat and a suit, showing its teeth and letting its tongue dangle out of its mouth in a kind of getting ready to eat someone kind of way. I remember being scared shitless of that picture, screaming at it until my parents worked out what was wrong and tore the pages out of the book. Except I don't really remember that at all. I just remember remembering it. The memory was one of the things that had been stored in the tank in Quedge's flat, and the place where I'd been made. It was only while I was heading through the streets of Soho, without knowing whether to walk or run, that I started to ask myself what the real first memory was. I remembered being at the police station, seeing Quedge for the first time. No, before that, there was building sites on the embankment, where I'd been found slobbering down my chin and talking like a junkie. And before that, there were still memories, but they'd felt like they'd gone cold on me. Machine memories, just programs, supplied by the tank and sucked into my body through the skin. The building site was the first real thing I remembered, so that was where I was heading. Even now, I don't know whether it was because I thought I was going back to my roots, or because I already knew what was going to be there. 95. 2 weeks earlier, I'd stood in a cave on Simia KK-98, seeing the bottle from the outside for the first time. That was the moment when I'd given up. I think the moment when I'd put my future in Quedge's hands. I wasn't real. Nothing I knew was real. This was obvious to the lowest any pretend human. This was obviously the lowest any pretend human could go. So what was the point of fighting it? Except now, on the streets of London on the 11th of October, I knew better. Even in the pretend world, I was a pretend person made by Quedge and employers for reasons I was only just starting to figure out. Yes, in the hierarchy of the real universe, I was about as far down the ladder as anyone could get. The lowest of the low. That's me. The most unreal of the unreal. Sometimes I think the only reason I lived through the end of the world was that I wasn't important enough for anybody to get rid of. 96, 97. The building site was sealed off by a big mesh fence. The workmen had only just laid the foundations when I'd been arrested there, but now the skeleton of the building had been more or less finished, even though the site didn't look like it had been touched for more in the last couple of days. Nobody was bothering to build anything in London anymore. Not now that they'd seen the horror and found out how easy it was for things to get torn down. By night, the site looked like a place for dead things, more like an archaeological dig than anything else. I headed around the skeleton building once I'd squeezed through the gap in the mesh, past the vans and cement mixers that had all been abandoned there, past all the tools that had been left scattered across the gravel, when the horror had come? There wasn't anybody around. I hadn't seen any police since the Strand. There was the sound of traffic from the riverbank, but you couldn't see the road from here. I finally reached the corner of the building and stepped around the edge of the scaffolding. There was a big empty patch of the ground on that side of the site, which was where I was remembered being when I'd started screaming at the sky and drooling on my shirt 2 weeks earlier. The space was pretty much the way it had been, still littered with the things the builders had left behind, the broken cola bottles and the old packed lunch wrappers. And Quedge was there. The only light was from the street lamps on the other side of the fence, but you couldn't miss him. Quedge looked the same as he had when he'd left the flat, with his raincoat pulled tight around his neck and his body all hunched like his bones still felt too old and fragile to let him walk properly. He looked up as soon as I turned the corner, so he must have been on the edge, maybe expecting someone to find him there. Even before he realized who I was, his face had started twisting itself up. I think he was scared, more than anything. When he finally recognized me, the look got worse, and I could see the muscles getting tighter under his clothes. He looked like he was trying to stop himself running away. For a while, we just stared at each other. Eventually, I managed to look down. Quedge's coat was covered in streaks of black, which is how blood usually looks in that kind of light. There was something in his hand, something sharp and shiny, but I didn't care about the details enough to focus on it. Besides, I was too busy staring at the ground, at the thing that was lying at his feet, covered in spots and smears of black. "I'm sorry," Quedge said. He must have tried his best to sound like he meant it. He must have really, really tried. 98. I won't bother describing the body. I'm not sure I could if I wanted to. Whenever I think about it, I imagine the photo from the Jack the Ripper book of the woman turned into dog meat in her bedroom. The body at Quedge's feet wasn't that bad, though. I'm sure it wasn't. Whatever else I might want to say about him, I wouldn't pretend that he enjoyed what he did. So the mutilations were clinical ones. I'm sure of that much. I'd like to think that the wounds to the chest had been made first, that the woman had been neatly stabbed to death before Quedge had taken away all traces of her identity, face, fingers, scalp, etc. He dressed her up, which was something I'm sure he didn't have to do. She must have been naked when she'd come out of the cloning tank in the flat, almost as if Quedge wanted the world to know that he wasn't getting a kick out of this, even if nobody was really watching. I think the worst thing was knowing what the woman must have looked like before Quedge had gone to work on her. She must have looked exactly like me. What was Quedge thinking, I wonder, when he made the first cut? Was he thinking about all the bad times between us, just to make the job easier? Quedge used to be a policeman. Mr. Good Cop. I have to keep telling myself that. And I have to ask myself whether he only fell that far because of his employers, or whether he'd had a talent for killing anyways, and they just exploited it. 99. Why? I said. I wasn't even angry. I wasn't even upset. I wasn't even empty by them. Empty as a non-real person in a non-real world should be. Quedge dropped the knife, or whatever it was. I think I saw him shaking his head when he finally said something you could hear, the words making little bubbles of spit at the back of his throat. "Ritual," he said. His voice went all high-pitched and squawky at the end, and I knew he was trying to make everything he said sound like an apology, not just to me, but the universe in general. I remembered that what he'd taught me about the bottle, and the way the followers of the kings of space could program it. How they were just like Lady Diamond's Egyptian priest masons. What was it that Quedge had said? That to make the bottle do what you wanted, you needed the sacrifice? "They told me to do it," Quedge said. His eyes were flicking from side to side, watching the shadows and the skeletons of the building site. Anything rather than look at me head on, I suppose. "There's 2 other women," I said. I still didn't feel anything. "Did you kill them as well?" Quedge started to nod. He changed his mind. He opened and closed his mouth, looking for the right defense. "They weren't women," he said, after a while. He'd started whining now. "They were clones. My employers, they wanted me to use real people. Whoever I could find. In the bottle." 100. I'm remembering that mantra of mine again. We make things out of sin, with blood and human skin. We make things out of dust, so we can smash them up. 101. I didn't say anything. I just stood there and waited for him to finish. I remembered seeing a documentary about the Nuremberg trials on BBC Two, about how Albert Speer had done his best to look guilty but sorry to get out of a life sentence. Funny to think about that. Funny thing to think, really, at a time like that. "I couldn't do it," said Quedge. "I couldn't just kill people, not the people in the bottle. That's why I asked for the cloning stuff. I had to make the sacrifices, to finish the ritual. 3 people. That was the way it worked. I had to kill 3 people." "So you just made them? In your flat?" Quedge nodded. He looked down at his feet, but down was where the body was. I saw him shut his eyes. "Who am I?" I asked. "Christine Summerfield," he said, without even pausing. Was I made in the cloning thing?" He nodded again. So who do I look like? I asked. Who was I a clone of? Qued shrugged. Nobody. I don't know. Nobody? The genes came from the files. The genes came from the files, Quedge snapped, more aggressively than he'd meant to. I think. I took a step back. He was making me feel like I was asking all the wrong questions. It was a standard human template. I don't know. So what about my memories? Are they standard too? No. Finally, Quedge looked up. He looked straight at me, although his face was just as wrinkly and confused as it had been when he shut his eyes. All the victims, I had to give them memories. They wouldn't have counted otherwise. It's in the rules of the ritual. It's how the Sphinxes think. So whose memories are they? I asked. 102. They were the memories of the blonde girl in the photo, of course. When he'd arrived on Earth, Quedge had headed straight for Lady Diamond's shop to learn about the way the people in the bottle perform their own rituals. He'd met Lady there, and Cal and Dorian and all the others, including the blonde girl who was, in a sense, me. Quedge didn't go into details. I got the feeling he'd seduced her, although he must have felt guilty enough without mentioning a thing like that. While the girl had been looking the other way, he'd copied her long-term memories using whatever magic brain technology his employers had given to him, then he'd dumped her. Obviously, he'd changed the memories a bit before he'd programmed them into the tank. For a start, he'd given me a new name, probably just to give me an identity separate from the blonde girl, so he wouldn't feel too bad about what he had to do next. Summerfield, after Bernice. Chris, after himself? I should think so. Another question. If you had to give a name to someone you were going to kill, would you name her after one of your friends? Well, actually, I think I would. But then the friends I had, the friends I remembered having, they were just gagging for it, weren't they? The two Christine Summerfields had been grown and slaughtered before I'd even been made. For the sake of the ritual, Quedge had killed them in a very specific pattern, choosing the right places as well as the right times. The flat obviously hadn't been good enough, which was why they'd turned up in the gutters around London. I suppose he had to leave the bodies for the police to find as well. Maybe it's not the actual murder that powers the ritual, but what it does to the culture. Or maybe I'm filling in too many blanks here. I never found out what the blonde girl's name was. I suppose I should have asked. After all, we had so much in common. 103. You've killed me twice already, I said. I was trying to sound angry, but I was failing miserably. Frankly, I didn't care what happened to the last two Chris Summerfields. It was hard enough remembering to care about myself. Qued shook his head. He was still eyeing up the shadows, waiting for the world to punish him for what he'd done. The clones needed memories. But I buried the memories as deep as I could. They weren't people. Am I a person? Yes! Look, the others weren't conscious or anything. I mean, before they started acting like people, I had to... He had trouble getting the next word out. I helped him. Kill, I said. Kill them, Quedge blurted. I killed them, before the memories could get rooted inside of them. I wouldn't have done it otherwise. Really. And what about me? I asked. 104. I can't help wondering how Quedge moved me from his flat to the building site on the night I was made. In the hired car, or by some kind of time traveler technology, I don't know. I don't know exactly what went wrong, either, because Quedge was gabbling when he explained it all to me. I was a walking vegetable back then, before my memories had taken root properly. Maybe I made a break for it, not knowing who I was or what was happening to me. But somehow I'd ended up standing in the middle of the building site, screaming and slobbering like a little baby seeing the world for the first time. Lucky for me, really, that the police came along at just the right moment. I've been thinking about this a lot. Was the blonde girl a cokehead? like I was? According to Quedge, my memories started changing when they settled in, to fill the gaps and make a sense of the world around me. But note how how I was always surprised when I looked in the mirror, like I was half expecting to see somebody else there. When the police found me and took me out of Quedge's clutches, they thought I was a cokehead, and maybe it was because they treated me like one that I turned into one. Who can say? No wonder the Sphinx had attacked me back in Lady Diamond's shop. It knew I didn't belong inside the bottle, because, let's face it, I didn't belong anywhere. When it bit me, it must have tasted a hint of Quedge and decided to go for a bigger, tastier, more important target. By the time Quedge found me again, or I found him, it was too late to finish the ritual. I'd turned into a proper person. The memories had settled. I might not have been exactly real, but I was so close to being real that Quedge couldn't bring himself to cut my face off. Nice guy. I always knew he felt guilty about me. I always thought it was because he dragged me into his life without asking, but the truth was that I'd always been a part of his life. He felt guilty because he knew he was responsible for me. And if it hadn't been for a lucky accident, he'd have killed me in the night I'd come out of the tank. If I was chicken lickin', then he was the fox. God only knows what must have been going through his head while we'd been sleeping together. 105. Once it was all over, Quedge had finished explaining things to me and was panting to get the air moving around his lungs again. I ended up staring back down at his feet, at the skinny, dark-haired mess that was lying there, bleeding into the gravel. My identical twin. Not that I felt much for her. The orders haven't changed, said Quedge. The cracks in his voice had just about healed over by now. The orders. That was what Keast had been talking about to him over the last few days. The production of a new Chris Summerfield, which Quedge could bump off to finish the rituals. The treaty with the Sphinxes and the trouble with the horror had just delayed things a bit. The plan was the same as ever. It's that easy, I said. It's that easy to kill me. Quedge didn't answer. He'd shut his eyes again. Why? I said. You haven't told me why. What's the ritual for, anyways? What are your employers trying to do? As it happens, Quedge never had to give me an answer to that. Because the ritual was over, and things were happening even while I was asking the big question. There was a light in the sky, and the night was opening up. The walls of the bottle were moving. The world around us, the whole wide world, was starting to follow Quedge's instructions. It had just gone to midnight. It was the 12th of October, 1970. Notes on the end. 106 to 8. It wasn't like before. The bottle was opening, but it wasn't a tunnel like the one the Sphinx had made in Quedge's flat. Wherever you were in London, however good or bad your view from the bedroom window was, you would have seen it. The horizon was coming away from the sky. A gap was opening up between the city and the night, and there was a hot orange light pouring into the world through the crack, flooding in from the outside world. There was an alien air sweeping through the streets, blowing litter into little tornadoes, cracking all the windows along the embankment. The people of London must have looked up at the sky, remembered the horror, and not known whether to start screaming or just roll their eyes in a not again kind of way. Space shifted. Distance changed. The buildings moved aside, like that bit in the Ten Commandments with the Red Sea, until there was an open pathway across the whole of the capital. A valley of light stretching all the way from the Thames to the NW1. The building was at the end of the path, and from where we were standing, we could see right down its length into the other world in the distance. The buildings in front of us were cut in half, and a 5-mile wide stretch of space was neatly slotted into the middle. There were shapes at the end of the pathway. They were little black smudges against the light, marching toward us from the place where the horizon used to be. The column was miles wide and too long for us to be able to see the end. We both just stared, peering into the distance, forgetting about the smell of the blood on the gravel. They were coming in their thousands, maybe their millions, armed and armored, in their black metal skins shining in the light. I could see their faces now, or maybe just the faces they decided to wear for the night. It wasn't an army, exactly. It was an exodus. Some of them were marching alone. Some of them were marching in groups. Some of them were marching under the flags of the old houses and colleagues and colleges. And some of them were riding in the backs of animals that must have been grown in tanks to take the weight of giants. And they were giants. Even if most of them weren't much taller than that. Even if most of them weren't much taller than Quedge, they looked huge. Like whole powerhouses of energy that had been squeezed down into a human body. They had boots that could crush rock, and hands that could tear metal, and brains so strong you could feel the weight of them from miles away, smothering you with their ideas. Giants, in the only sense of the word that mattered. Not all of them had armor, just the first few hundred ranks. There were others, following the soldiers, things from the same species, wearing high-collared robes instead of the black plating. There weren't just agents, you could tell that much. These were Quedge's employers in the flesh. The ones who rode the animals. The ones who rode the animals were covered in spikes and crests and horns, so you couldn't always tell where the riders ended and where the riders started and the things they were sitting on ended. The noise? There aren't any words to describe it. The sound of that many feet crashing against the ground. It blotted out everything apart from the hymns. You could hear the muttering coming from some parts of the column, like songs that had been translated into computer talk, but the groups inside the column couldn't agree on a single prayer for everyone. They weren't heading for the building site. Well, why would they be? They broke off from the column in 5s and 10s and 100s, filtering into the streets on either side. The giants were pushing their way between the buildings, spreading out until they filled up all the empty spaces. They must have taken Covent Garden first, then Russell Square, then Euston, and then the column went on forever, and I knew London couldn't hold all of them, even if they trampled everything that got in their way. Soon they'd be in Oxford, and in Birmingham, and in Brighton, and in Liverpool, and in Edinburgh, and past the coast. They'd still be marching, in bodies that had been specially built for walking on water, I should think. After what must have been half an hour staring, I finally looked to Quedge. But Quedge didn't look back at me. The story he'd told me about his employers sending a survival team to Earth had been a lie from the start. The people, the things he had worked for, had come for what they really wanted. Their one last hope in getting away from the gods. It was the Great House's invasion of the Earth. It was the end of the world. 109. So, this is where the story ends, more or less. All I have to do now is resolve things, just like Quedge would have done. I'm looking at that photograph again. The one of the dragon boats over London, with the Sphinx wrapping itself around one of the spires and that Quedge's employers had planted there. The picture was taken a week or so after the invasion started, once all of the buildings of central London had been sucked into the sky and recycled. The Sphinx gods had wanted to take a look at the Earth inside the bottle, to make sure the time travelers were treating it properly. They sent thousands of Sphinxes to flap over the world, all taking notes through their big glass eyes. They only stayed for one evening. I took the photo myself from the windows of one of the spires, from the quarters Quedge had been given, in fact. Of course, Quedge wasn't there at the time, off on more secret missions, probably. I'd spoken to him only once since the 12th of October, and when he'd told me that I was welcome to stay at his place on New Earth if I'd wanted. I shrugged. I don't think I'd said more than 4 words in the whole conversation. If I hadn't been there, in the safety of one of the spires, then I probably would have suffered the same fate as all the other human beings in London. Which made me wonder, would Quedge have come back for me? If I'd stayed home when he'd gone out to finish the ritual, or would he have let his people bury me, like he'd buried the other 2 women with my face? A few days after that, I was back on Simia KK-98 for the last time. Quedge's people had let me choose where I wanted to go. As far as the time travelers were concerned, the humans inside the bottle were an irrelevance, but Quedge must have had a word in their ears. I owe him that much, anyway. They never would have thought about genocide. Not with laws as strict as theirs, but the bottle people hardly counted. They weren't any more real than, say, the characters in Poggle's Wood. That was their view, and I think Quedge very nearly managed to convince himself that they were right towards the end. It was Keast who met me on Simia KK-98 when I stepped out of the bottle and into the fortress. "Well," he said. He sounded a lot less impatient than he had done now the great work was over. I shrugged. "I can't go back," I said. "You're not going to stay with Quedge?" I tried to figure out whether he was jealous. I don't think he was. Whatever had happened between us, it was resolved as far as he was concerned, just like the whole world had been resolved. 111. Before I tell you where I ended up, maybe I should explain exactly what happened to Earth after Quedge's employers turned up in their millions. It didn't take the governments of the world long to notice what was happening. Somebody somewhere started launching nuclear missiles, and the rest of the world followed suit. A lot of missiles were fired at England, while some of them were fired at other superpowers, probably for complicated political reasons that really weren't very important anymore. It might have been called World War III if anybody had been taking note. The missiles that were sent to England never detonated. Quedge's employers weren't stupid. They had taken precautions. On the other hand, any missiles aimed at parts of the world that hadn't been invaded yet went off as planned. The TV and radio stations stopped broadcasting after the first few explosions, so there weren't any big stories about the takeover. No David Frost interviews with eyewitnesses. Nobody ever found out what happened to Charles Manson either, although I'm sure he would have been interested if he found out that the world had ended during the Tom Jones show. Meanwhile, the aliens hardly noticed that half the planet had gone radioactive. Quedge's employers didn't feel any need to talk with the humans at all. They just marched where they wanted to march, tearing down anything they didn't like the look of, and taking over the facilities that might have been even slightly useful. They left the human power station standing, so they had a handy energy source to work with once they got their own systems up and running. During his one-way conversation with me, Quedge told me that they were planning on turning the sun into some kind of black hole, although he might have just been talking big. The invaders didn't try to kill off the population or anything like that. The population wasn't even an issue. Any humans who died just got caught up in the machinery. 112, 113. I don't remember which of the big cities got torn out of the ground first. It all happened so quickly. The architecture was scooped up by machines the size of the Isle of Wight, and then recycled, turned into the materials the time travels needed to make their own buildings. The people? They were all probably stored in some kind of big cultural database somewhere. From what I could see, from my place of safety up in the kind of London spires, there was a new kind of human civilization forming down on the ground. Whole families, whole communities of survivors living in the cracks of the new house society. Not exterminated, not hunted, just forgotten about. Why had Quedge's employers picked Earth as their new home anyway? Well, apart from the fact that it was the same size as their homeworld, and had the same length of day, believe me, this is the voice of experience speaking, I think it was to do with the resources. They knew they could live on Earth even before they'd finish rebuilding the place. They knew they could move in straight away and worry about the redecorations later. Then there were the people. I think they knew what would happen to the people. Quedge's employers didn't need slaves as such. They don't have any sadistic urges at all, as far as I've been able to figure out. Like I said, the houses ignored just about everybody. What the humans on Earth did, they did to themselves. It started just before I left Earth, for the last time. The survivors had been skulking in the underworld, down in the shadows of the spires, and after a week or two, they must have figured out they couldn't live like that for much longer. They could find food and water, but all their culture had been taken away from them, and there was no way the people of 1970 could survive without their posters and their icons and their smiley faces. The day before I walked out of the bottle, I looked down from the spire and saw the first of them crawling up from the ground, clambering into the walkways between the new buildings. They were human, but they were wearing armor, and they could climb walls like they'd been born to it. The humans had started asking Quedge's employers for favors. It was all they could do. And Quedge's employers, paying attention to the bottle people for the first time, had agreed to help. The aliens must have drowned the surface of England with potions, giving the people who lived in there a chance to mutate, to turn into things the invaders could use as their agents. There wasn't any compulsion, I don't think. The humans were just starting to work out that life would be better this way. 1:14. I met Quedge one more time, after I took the photo of the Sphinx. It was the day before I left Earth, 2 days after the invaders decided to turn the sky orange. I'd gone down to the ground level for the first time since the spires had been built. They'd all been put up in one afternoon, natch. Floating down to the ruins on a current of warm air, past the humans who were just starting to crawl up out of the underworld, blinking at the sunlight through those brand new compound eyes. Genetic social climbing, I suppose. There were gaps between the spires down at the ground level, streets made out of the crunched-up wreckage of old London. I didn't have any reason for being there. I just wandered. Through the alleyways that had been lined with crushed cars, past the remains of the human race, past all the remains the human race had left behind, along the broken pavements and through the skeletons of heavy machinery. Eventually, I found a building that had been left more or less intact, although the world had been shattered and one of the outer walls had apparently been sucked up and reprocessed. The building had been a burger cafe while it had been alive. Not an American-style one, not like a wimpy bar. A British one. There were yellow rubber seats inside, cartoon menus on the walls, and yes, big red plastic tomatoes on the tables, full of dried-up ketchup. I sat down in the near dark inside the restaurant and tried to feel reassured. But this was, if anything, even less real than the world up above. Pretending that this was normal somehow seemed sick. I'd been sitting there for about 20 minutes when Quedge came through the doors. He didn't have any reason for being there either, so unless it was all a stupid coincidence, he must have followed me down into the underworld. How touching. 1:15. Of course, not all the humans agreed to the change. I heard there were fanatics, especially in Russia and the Middle East, who started building their own H-bombs and blowing up cities. The cities that were still human-run, that is. The ones the aliens weren't protecting. I think they called that a moral victory. I can just imagine Ted Heath and Harold Wilson living half-naked in the rubble of England, fighting out their tribal wars and never giving in to the time travelers' rule. But by the time I left the planet, I think most of the people were ready to evolve. And it was a kind of evolution, wasn't it? They were changing their bodies to suit the world around them. The next great step forward for mankind, and it had all happened in less than 30 days. They were shedding their humanity, all taking on exactly the same program for living. They must have seen Quedge's employers the same way Quedge's employers saw the gods. 1:16. "You shouldn't be here," said Quedge. He was sitting opposite me in the buried restaurant, trying not to make eye contact. Even in the dark, you could tell he was sick. He'd lost weight in the week or so since I'd seen him last. He was still wearing his suit, but it was dangling on his shoulders, like it had died on him and started rotting. Age had caught up with him as well. Time must have noticed that he'd been a kid for too long and slapped a few big black lines around his eyes. Also, his hair was falling out. I got the urge to reach out and tug it, the same kind of urge that makes you pick at scabs. "Nowhere else to go," I said. There was a long pause after that. "Christine," Quedge began, but then he gave up. That was the way things worked in this world, wasn't it? Even now the time travelers had taken over, nothing ever got sorted out. Not really. Even if your boyfriend had ripped your face off 3 times over, even if your whole life was a lie designed just for his benefit, what could you do? You couldn't end it all in one big argument. You just had to sit there and run out of things to say, letting all the awkwardness and clumsiness suffocate you to death. "Are you sick?" I asked. Quedge nodded his head. "Body's dying. Radiation poisoning. Got too close to one of the H-bomb sites." "Will you get rebuilt?" I said, just making conversation. "Yeah," said Quedge. Whether he was going to regenerate into something like Keist, or into a new version of himself, or even into something specially designed for a life inside the redecorated bottle, I didn't ask. I didn't care enough. In the end, I just got up and walked out of the restaurant. 1:17. Yes, I know, I was mass-produced. Yes, I know I'm not a real native of the bottle. But I was born on Earth in 1970, and all my memories come from there. So you'll pardon me if I still think of it as home, won't you? Maybe that's why I left the bottle, so I could finally feel like I'd resolved something. The only way I could resolve anything, between me and Quedge, and between me and Keist, or between me and the Earth. By walking out. Starting over in a whole new universe. I wonder if the horror's learning anything back in the bottle. I wonder if it's still alive. Quedge's employers might have tracked it down already, whatever body it's wearing. For all I know, they've turned it into another one of their weapons. Poor thing. Not much of a life. And it's all my fault, of course. By now I should think I'm the last human survivor of the Earth in the bottle. Quedge's employers will have covered the place with potions in the last few months. If Darwin was right, then the ones who didn't evolve will just have gone under, just leaving behind their bones and relics for the next generation to either dig up or build over. 1:18. Keist dropped me off on Ordificia after I left the bottle, one of Earth's colony planets a long, long way from Della. He said I'd be dead before the gods got round to taking it over, but he didn't sound like he meant it in a bad way. I said thanks. That was pretty much as far as the goodbyes went. I brought this rucksack with me from the Earth, and I packed it all with the things Quedge had salvaged from the wreckage, including some handy bits and pieces from the 26th century, which is, after all, my time now. The credit card is the most useful thing. I don't think it's got a credit limit, which I suppose is one of the perks of time travel. I used the card to rent a living space on Ordificia, and I used it to book passage off the planet, heading for another colony a bit closer to the galactic center. That's what I've been doing these last few months, moving from colony to colony. Ordificia, Cryptostofen, Gardener's World, Hideout 7, Lubellin, Shatner's Climax, Ultra Capricis, following one of old Quedge's pocket star charts in no particular hurry, taking in the scenery all along the way, looking at all the ruins the civilizations of the real universe have left behind, and watching the daily news updates from the part of space where Della used to be. Getting to this planet was the hardest part. It's a long way from any of Earth's colonies, so I had to hire a ship of my own and a crew who'd been told to come back and pick me up in a couple days' time. I'm sitting in the ruins as I write this. The ruins that Quedge's employers left behind when they moved away from their homeworld and took over the bottle. They wrecked the whole planet, by the look of things. Made sure there were no bones left behind, no relics, nothing to give the gods any clues, when the gods finally get this deep into the galaxy, that is. I know not all of the time travelers went to Earth. I think some of them were talking about setting up other colonies in the real universe, staying in their own continuum until they can see the whites of the gods' eyes, but the homeworld's been completely evacuated and gutted, just like my world was gutted. So here I am in the rubble, with orange sunshine pouring through in the holes of the ceiling, writing the story of my life. All of my life, start to finish, for no particular reason. I'm going to leave it here, in what must have been the capital city of the homeworld. This place used to be the font of all galactic wisdom or something. And I get the last word. Ha. 119. How do I feel now that it's all over? Not as bad as you might think. I've learned to deal with the fact that I'm not technically a real person, anyway. It's all to do with my theory about the gods. Quedge's employers never told us what they'd found out about the gods, and what it was that scared them out of their own universe. But I think I know. After all, when the time travelers arrived in the bottle, didn't they look like gods to the humans? From the humans' point of view, Quedge's employers might as well have had an ultimate power. More power than even the time travelers were used to, once they had the codes to rebuild the bottle from the inside. Well, just imagine that Quedge's universe isn't the real universe at all. Just imagine that everything here, Della, the homeworld, Bernice Summerfield and all, is inside another bottle. Bottles inside bottles inside bottles inside... Oh, you get the idea. 1,000 universes, all stacked, one inside the another. My theory is this. I think the gods of Della come from somewhere outside the bottle, outside the real universe. Where they come from, they're probably just like Quedge's employers. People who have cracked the secrets of time travel, and at least in their own world. But like Quedge's employers, they had enemies. They had to escape. So they came here, into this world, and they pushed aside the time travelers who were already there, not caring about them any more than the time travelers cared about the humans. They probably wasted a couple million years getting used to the way this universe works, maybe even spending a few aeons asleep, recharging their batteries after the journey. Then they woke up, and all hell broke loose. That's what got Quedge's employers so scared, I think. That the fact that they were up against themselves, only bigger, harder, more real. At least that's my theory. It helps me deal with things anyways, because it means that none of us here are real. Not even the people who weren't grown in the cloning machine or built inside a bottle, but maybe I'm just trying to make myself feel better. Who knows? The only question I don't want to ask myself is this. What the hell must have the gods' enemies been like, to scare the gods into coming here? 120. So here, where the story ends, out in the ruins of the homeworld. By the way, I'm off the cocaine now, although that's mainly because you can't get a hold of this stuff in the time zone. You can pick up all kinds of space-age drugs on the colonies, but so far I've been too scared to try any of them. They might make me see things 600 years too bright and too fast for my head to deal with. I'm sure I'll give in eventually, though. I know there's a bigger world out there, on the other side of the glass, and I'm still stupid enough to think that all I need to be able to see it is a little chemical push. After I leave the planet, I'll start drifting again. Towards Della, I think. There's one thing I'm still curious about, and it's this. I want to know what happened to Bernice Summerfield. Because in this universe, she's the closest thing I've got to family. Of course, this means I'm going to the part of space that's run by the gods, but so what? I've hung around with higher beings before. Maybe they'll let me visit their home universe, and I can keep moving upwards and upwards through the worlds until I finally find out for certain what's real and what isn't. I suppose I should be more worried about what happened to the blonde girl from Covent Garden when the end of the world came, but frankly, I just can't find any sympathy for her at all. 121 to 80 to 128, these pages left blank. And that is the end of Dead Romance. There are a few short stories here from Lawrence Miles, which I will probably read later, just because I haven't properly read them, and I've heard they're very good. So I think that would be fun to read on stream for the first time. But I want to thank you for sticking it out with me for all this time. It's now past midnight, so the Indiegogo is over, and, well, much like the world, I suppose. I want to thank you regardless, though, for listening to me wherever you are, and if you are listening to this after the fact, and it's before the first week of April of 2025, you can still reach out to us and find a way to contribute to Dead Romance on Stage. Just message us through our various social medias here on the screen hole, and I will be more than happy to help you help us. But it's been a few hours, so I bid you good night and good night.